15th of March, 2025, and I was trying to get my my video to continue to play earlier this morning, and it wouldn't, and still now it's not working. So I did end up being able to get it on another internet provider, and so I will share that. It's going to be off of the premium. Anyways, I haven't been going premium. Now that I have my 5 required hours per month already done, you'll notice the last couple of days I've not done any Rumble Premium. And this is where we kicked off. Sorry, this is where we left off. Around this mark. I just put it a few seconds earlier. And
suspect.
Here we go.
At the time, all of our examinations, all of the evidence was pointing to Iran.
One thing is for certain. In 1998, the $150 million contract to rebuild the Khobar Towers was awarded to the Saudi bin Laden Group. But it was a series of events in 1998 that introduced the broader public to Osama bin Laden. In February of that year, bin Laden, following up on a declaration of war against America that he had made to CNN's TV cameras in an interview with Peter Bergen the previous year, issued his fatwa calling on Muslims to kill Americans. The ruling to kill Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Mosque from their grip, and in order for their armies to move out of all of the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. In May of that year, John Miller, then reporting for ABC...
It's not showing. This is like so censored. I've never seen it this bad. I've never seen it this bad before. Okay, I'm going to try to present again. All right.
ABC News, but soon to become the FBI's chief spokesman, traveled to Afghanistan for a dramatic Nightline report on The Most Dangerous Man You've Never Heard Of that would air on ABC the following month.
He lives in a cave atop a range of mountains in Afghanistan. From there, he controls a web of financial, logistical, and strategic assistance to Sunni Islamic groups.
I'm going to stop recording me just so you don't see me.
Engaged in what they consider a jihad or holy war. The principal targets of that jihad are the Israelis and the United States. His name is Osama bin Laden, and you will meet him a little later in this program. He does nothing to undermine the profile of himself as a terrorist leader with global influence. Indeed, he seems to take considerable satisfaction. From there, he controls a web of financial, logistical, and strategic assistance to Sunni Islamic groups engaged in what they consider a jihad or holy war. The principal targets of that jihad are the Israelis and the United States. His name is Osama bin Laden, and you will meet him a little later in this program. He does nothing to undermine the profile of himself as a terrorist leader with global influence. Indeed, he seems to take considerable satisfaction in it, even though the profile has been drawn by U.S. intelligence agencies.
We believe that the biggest thieves in the world are Americans, and the biggest terrorists on earth are the Americans. The only way for us to fend off these assaults is by using similar means. We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniform and civilians. They're all targets in this fatwa.
Bin Laden has issued these fatwas and made these threats before, but this time there's something different. He put a time cap on it, saying that whatever action will be taken against Americans in the Gulf, whatever violence awaits, will occur within the next few weeks.
And, in August of 1998, the name of Osama bin Laden, terror mastermind, and his shadowy terror group, Al Qaeda, finally exploded into the public consciousness.
Terrorist attack on Americans half a world away. It is the worst thing I've ever seen.
Clearly a part of someone's war against the United States, although it is still unclear at this hour who our enemy is.
Oh, there was a huge explosion. I bit deaf from it. We all just hit the floor as soon as it went off.
On the morning of August 7th, 1998, two Saudis in Kenya, Mohammed al-Awali and Jihad al-Yazam, both of whom had been in the hut when John Miller was interviewing Osama bin Laden earlier that year, loaded some boxes into their Toyota cargo truck and headed off to the American Embassy in downtown Nairobi. The boxes contained 2,000 pounds of TNT, aluminum nitrate, Allah Awad, an Egyptian known as Ahmed the German for his fair hair, loaded a similar bomb into a gasoline truck in Tanzania and set off for the American Embassy in Dar es Salaam. The Saudis arrived at the Nairobi Embassy at 10:30 a.m. Awali jumped out of the truck as it approached the gates, demanding that the security guard raise the drop bar protecting the entrance. The guard refused. Awali threw a stun grenade into the courtyard and ran, and then the bomb went off. The blast ripped the face off of the embassy building, collapsing a nearby secretarial college and lighting the tar-covered street and a nearby bus on fire. 213 were dead and 4,500 injured. 9 minutes later, Ahmed the German parked the gasoline truck in the parking lot of the American Embassy in Dar es Salaam and detonated his bomb. He had parked next to a water tanker truck, which ended up absorbing much of the blast, but the building was still badly damaged. 11 were dead and 85 injured. The message was clear and was dutifully broadcast by media around the world. A new terror group had conducted a sophisticated, coordinated attack against multiple U.S. targets overseas, and its leader was waging holy war against Americans. Al Qaeda had arrived.
What had happened was the first major attack by Al Qaeda on American targets and the worst international terrorist incident on African soil. Afterwards, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation placed Al Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden on its list of most wanted fugitives.
But, like so many events in the Al Qaeda story, this attack too bore the fingerprints of American intelligence on each stage of its development and execution. The attacks, prosecutors later discovered, were being planned as far back as 1993, when Osama bin Laden sent his FBI, CIA, Green Beret triple agent extraordinaire, Ali Mohammed, to survey potential US, British, French, and Israeli targets in Nairobi. According to Mohammed's own testimony, I later went to Khartoum, where my surveillance files and photographs were reviewed by Osama bin Laden, Abu Hafs, Abu Ubaidah, and others. Bin Laden looked at the picture of the American embassy and pointed to where a truck could go as a suicide bomber. Joining Mohammed on the scouting mission was Anas al-Libi, a member of a Libyan al-Qaeda cell known as al-Muqatila. Described as the computer wizard of al-Qaeda's hierarchy, not only was al-Libi personally trained by Mohammed at the al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan, he was also a protected British intelligence asset. Al-Libi applied for asylum in Britain in 1995, claiming to be a political enemy of the Libyan government. But, as The Guardian later reported, astonishingly, despite suspicions that he was a high-level al-Qaeda operative, al-Libi was given political asylum in Britain and lived in Manchester until May of 2000, when he eluded a police raid on his house and fled abroad. The raid discovered a 180-page al-Qaeda manual for jihad containing instructions for terrorist attacks. Even more incredibly, not only did the British government grant that asylum, they then recruited al-Libi for a failed MI6 operation to assassinate Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 1996, and then let him continue to live in the country even after the embassy bombing, before ultimately letting him escape. According to FBI investigator Ali Soufan, the Manchester raid didn't just nab a manual for jihad, it caught al-Libi himself. As Soufan recounts in his book, The Black Banners, the British police let al-Libi go when he denied being a terrorist. He evaded the team that was sent to follow him and fled the country, eventually ending up on the US government's most wanted list with a $25 million reward for his capture. Yet another important figure in the bombing who was well known to American intelligence was Wadi al-Hajj, the naturalized American citizen who had assisted the Al-Qifa plotters, and who Mahmoud Abu Halima had identified to prosecutors after his arrest for the World Trade Center bombing. As was later revealed, U.S. intelligence had al-Hajj under surveillance during the entire period that the embassy bombing plot was being hatched, but once again merely watched as the attack unfolded. As the Los Angeles Times detailed, the CIA and the FBI missed key opportunities to prevent the blasts. They knew from wiretaps on al-Hajj's 4 Nairobi phones, as well as from the computer files they had seized, that Al Qaeda was forming a terror cell in the Kenyan capital. Indeed, US agents had in hand the names and identities of some of the key Nairobi cell members who would rent the bomb factory, build the bomb, buy the bomb truck, brief the suicide bombers, and even escort the bomb truck the day of the attack. Author Simon Reeve revealed even more damning evidence about CIA involvement in the plot in his 1999 book, The New Jackals. The CIA also had informants working within the East Africa cell, he reported, citing an interview with a CIA official. But they apparently failed to warn of bin Laden's plans. Even if the CIA sources within the plot had somehow failed to warn them of the attack, the fact that multiple members of the cell under their surveillance, including Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah, Ahmed Khalfan Gailani, Usama al-Kini, Mohammed Sadiq Odeh, and 5 other conspirators, all fled Kenya for Pakistan the night before the bombing, would have instantly raised alarm bells if the agency's intention had been to prevent an attack. Instead, the plotters conspired with CIA informants in their midst, and the attacks went ahead under the watchful eye of CIA, NSA, and FBI surveillance. However they transpired, the bombings succeeded in introducing Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda to the world stage. Despite the years of intelligence agency surveillance, and even the creation of a virtual CIA station dedicated solely to the capture, arrest, or assassination of bin Laden and his network, it wasn't until after the embassy bombings that the world at large began to hear the name of Osama bin Laden. On August 20th, 3 weeks after the bombing, and just 3 days after being publicly interrogated about the Monica Lewinsky affair, President Clinton ordered a missile strike on alleged Al Qaeda targets in Afghanistan and Sudan, boldly proclaiming that actions against bin Laden and international terror had become a new mission for the US military.
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan because of the imminent threat they presented to our national security. I want to speak with you about the objective of this action and why it was necessary. Our target was terror. Our mission was clear: to strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent organizer and financier of international terrorism in the world today.
The strike, however, a barrage of 66 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting Al Qaeda's camp in Coast Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical plant thought to be manufacturing chemical weapons in Khartoum, was a spectacular failure on almost every level. Neither bin Laden nor Zawahiri were killed in the attacks, and the chemical weapons plant in Khartoum had nothing to do with either bin Laden or chemical weapons, but was in fact manufacturing much-needed medicines for the region. The plant's destruction, in the estimation of Werner Daum, then Germany's ambassador to Sudan, led to several tens of thousands of deaths in the region. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's longtime associate and future leader of Al Qaeda, was on one of bin Laden's monitored satellite phones at the time of the attack, telling BBC journalist Raoul Mullah Yousafzai that bin Laden has a message. He says, "I have not bombed the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. I have declared jihad, but I was not involved." Zawahiri's exact position would have been immediately detectable by American surveillance aircraft in the region, but, in a move that journalist Lawrence Wright called inexplicable, the aircraft were not available prior to the strike, and Zawahiri escaped unscathed. Bin Laden, meanwhile, was, according to CIA intelligence gleaned from intercepted satellite calls, going to be at his training camp in Khost the day of the missile strike. But he was not. He was, Clinton counter-terror czar Richard Clarke later speculated, tipped off about the attack by a retired head of the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service that had long been known as an adjunct of the CIA. The attacks did succeed in 2 key respects, however. They kept Clinton's personal dalliances in the Oval Office from leading America's nightly news broadcasts for at least one news cycle, and they reinforced the importance of the new threat to global security, Osama bin Laden. This new threat provided a green light for the American security establishment and its allies around the world to ramp up operations in the name of fighting the Al Qaeda menace. The FBI began an international investigation of the bombing. The CIA began a surge of reporting on terror threats that counter-terror officials later complained overwhelmed the system and diverted attention and resources. And in November of 1998, the United States federal court finally issued its first public indictment of Osama bin Laden. The first international arrest warrant for bin Laden, a confidential document intended only for police and judicial authorities, had in fact already been issued in April of that year. But it was not issued by the US. Instead, it was the Libyan government that had issued the warrant through Interpol. They were pursuing the terror mastermind for his part in the murder of 2 German intelligence agents in Libya in 1994. At the time, despite publicly recognizing bin Laden as the premier financier of international terrorism, the US and British governments downplayed the document, even making sure to scrub the charges against Osama and any mention of Libya's role in issuing the document from the public record. But this surge in activity around the Al Qaeda threat resulted in at least one surprising development. In one of the most consequential and underreported moves in this redoubled counterterrorism effort, Ali Mohammed was finally arrested. Contacted in the days after the bombing, Mohammed admitted to FBI agents that he knew who had carried out the attack, but would not give the government the names. Subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury in the Southern District of New York, he was finally arrested, although even the charges against him were kept secret from the public. On October 20th, 2000, Mohammed pled guilty to involvement in the embassy bombings, but he was never sentenced. He then disappeared from sight forever, held in what was later reported as protective custody. To this day, there is no public record of Ali Mohammed, the ex-US sergeant and FBI asset who admitted to his key role in Al Qaeda, ever being sentenced. There is no public record of his incarceration, and there are only a handful of accounts that have ever surfaced from people who talked to him in prison in the aftermath of 9/11. And, just like that, one of the deepest mysteries of the Al Qaeda story disappeared from public sight, never to be seen again. But despite all this increased activity, the same pattern of oversights and mistakes by the intelligence agencies continued unabated. On October 12, 2000, when a small fiberglass fishing boat approached the massive 8,300-ton USS Cole, a billion-dollar guided missile destroyer employing the latest stealth technology and armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles, and a 5-inch cannon, the sailors on board watched in amusement. The tiny skiff stopped amidships and 2 men stood up, waving and smiling. Then, a bomb exploded.
U.S. Navy officials in Bahrain today said suspected suicide bombers
badly damaged in a terrorist attack in Yemen.
American sailors were killed, injured, missing. Immediately suspect Osama bin Laden.
The boat had been carrying over 400 pounds of C4 explosive molded into a shaped charge. The explosion was immense, knocking over cars passing by on shore. In the city, miles away, people believed there was an earthquake taking place. The blast tore a hole 40 feet by 40 feet in the hull of the Cole, killing 17 U.S. servicemen and injuring 39 more. It was the deadliest attack on a U.S. destroyer in over a decade. But this attack, like all of Al Qaeda's spectacular terror attacks of the 1990s, was preceded by a string of missed opportunities and unheeded warnings. Not only was there intelligence about a potential attack on a U.S. naval ship from several different sources, including reports from multiple informants and intercepted phone calls to Al Qaeda's NSA-monitored Yemen communications hub, but, as Congressman Kurt Weldon revealed in 2005, a secret military intelligence operation codenamed Able Danger actually warned the Pentagon days before the bombing that an attack was going to take place in Yemen.
But 2 weeks before the attack on the Cole, in fact 2 days before the attack on the Cole,
they saw an increase of activity that led them to say to the senior leadership in the Pentagon at that time and the Clinton administration, there's something going to happen in Yemen, and we better be on high alert, but it was discounted. That story has yet to be told to the American people. Another Able Danger successful activity that was thwarted.
But even after the spectacular failure of these intelligence agencies to thwart the attack, and despite President Clinton's assurance that he would find and retaliate against the bomb plotters,
If, as it now appears, this was an act of terrorism, it was a despicable and cowardly act. We will find out who was responsible and hold them accountable.
the CIA repeatedly denied FBI investigators access to key information about the plot. But, it turns out, the CIA did have such information, and that information, deliberately withheld from the FBI or any other investigative agency, led directly into the heart of the operation behind the next spectacular terror attack to be blamed on Al Qaeda: 9/11.
Clear skies, 80% humidity. That's dropped about 10%.
Read this word the fast way. Get ready. Yes, ma'am. Get ready.
See that United 175 anywhere? That United 175 that just took off out of a thing. We might have a hijack over here, two of them.
Extensive coverage in this hour. There is something in the air.
We have some planes that stay quiet and will be okay. We're turning to the airport.
We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. One report said it can't.
From the beginning, 9/11 was presented to the public as an open and shut case. Osama bin Laden's name was raised on air by the TV news anchors within seconds of the second plane strike, and was endlessly repeated in the hours and days that followed. By the end of the week, the public was convinced that the events were the work of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and all of the subsequent investigations and commissions only served to bolster that preformed conclusion. So it was no surprise at all when, on September 14th, 2001, the FBI released its list of 19 hijackers, Muslims with Arabic names who, we were told, had been sent by bin Laden on a suicide mission. But who were these men? For the general public, the newscaster's solemn intonation that the 19 hijackers had been identified, followed by a mugshot-like lineup of photographs, was all that was needed to cement the case in their minds. Those who required more detail turned to made-for-TV dramas and documentaries to learn about the so-called Hamburg cell of radicalized Al Qaeda soldiers, which included Mohammed Atta, Ziad Jarrah, and Marwan al-Sheikhi, 3 of the alleged suicide pilots. Finally, the 9/11 Commission and its associated monographs, like the staff report on 9/11 and terrorist travel, attempted to fill in the paper trail for researchers concerned about the documentary record of these men, including their motivations and their movement. From these accounts, a picture emerged. These 19 terrorists, crack operatives handpicked by Osama bin Laden and trained in his terror camps in Afghanistan, had used their carefully honed spycraft to slip into the country, deftly avoiding scrutiny from the authorities even as they trained at flight schools in the US and finalized the operational details of their plan. Then, after years of meticulous preparation, these men, consumed by their hatred of the West, their love of Allah, and their devotion to bin Laden, deftly piloted their planes into their targets, wreaking havoc and devastation exactly as planned.
If everything goes well, every one of you should pat the other on the shoulder in confidence. Remind your brothers that this act is for Almighty God, or they should sing songs to boost their morale as the pious first generations did in the throes of battle. Afterwards, we will all meet in the highest heaven. Inshallah.
But this story, too, is a carefully constructed lie, every part of which falls apart under sustained scrutiny. In the official conspiracy theory of 9/11, The alleged hijackers were such devout fundamentalist Muslims that they were willing to give their lives for the cause. Marwan al-Sheikhi, we were told, was so devoted to his religious beliefs that he observed the Ramadan fast against medical advice after a stomach operation, causing him to fall severely ill. Ziad Jarrah, meanwhile, initially caroused and smoked during his early days in Hamburg, but then grew intensely religious and withdrawn. And, according to award-winning journalist Lawrence Wright, Mohammed Atta's extreme rigidity of character made him into a ruthless killer who constantly demonstrated an aversion to women. When reporters began following the trail that these supposed suicide soldiers had left behind, however, they began to uncover an altogether different story. Atta and his associates frequented strip clubs in San Diego, Las Vegas, and Daytona Beach, where they drank alcohol and ordered lap dances. They hung out for days at a time at Harry's Bar in New York, where Atta preferred a table near the piano. And, 3 nights before the attack, Atta and al-Sheikhi went to Shuckham's Oyster Bar in Fort Lauderdale where, according to bar manager Tony Amos, they consumed several drinks, became drunk, and gave the bartender a hard time about the bill. The guy Mohammed was drunk, his voice was slurred, and he had a thick accent, Amos told the Associated Press the day after 9/11. Even the New York Times reported on Atta and al-Sheikhi's high life during multiple visits to the Philippines between 1998 and 2000, where the pair of strict religious fundamentalists and an entourage of Arab men and their girlfriends flashed money, drank, and partied regularly. Many times I saw him let a girl go at the gate in the morning, the Times quoted one hotel chambermaid as recalling about Atta. It was always a different girl. And, during his research for Welcome to Terrorland, an investigation into the Venice, Florida flight schools where Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Sheikhi, and Ziad Jarrah were enrolled in the year 2000, Daniel Hopsicker interviewed Amanda Keller, a former stripper who claimed to have been Atta's girlfriend during his time in Venice, and who shared more stories about the partying of these alleged jihadis.
Guys had money flowing out their ass. I mean, excuse my language, but they never seemed to run out of money. I mean, they was just tossing money left and right. I mean, it was just like, oh my God. And they had massive supplies of cocaine. Whenever they'd run out, they'd go to the flight school.
But Hopsicker's investigation uncovered more than just the alleged hijackers' trail of booze, drugs, and women. He also became one of the only reporters to look into the strange connections of Huffman Aviation and the Florida Flight Training Center in Venice, Florida, where Atta, al-Sheikhi, and Jarrah trained the year before September 11th. Huffman Aviation was also the flight school that Yeslam bin Laden, Osama's half-brother, paid for flight lessons for one of his acquaintances. The flight school was run by Rudy Deckers, a Dutch native who was running a commuter airline with Wally Hilliard. Hilliard, the founder and former president of a Green Bay, Wisconsin-based insurance company, made news in October 2000 when his personal jet was found to be transporting 42 pounds of heroin and was seized by federal agents in what was called the biggest drug bust in Central Florida history. But Hilliard's charter airline startup had high-level political support. Jeb Bush, then governor of Florida, posed for photo ops in support of Hilliard's airline. Deckers, meanwhile, was arrested in 2012, having told an undercover agent, in the words of the criminal complaint against him, that he was involved in narcotics transportation via private aircraft, and that he has flown narcotics and U.S. currency previously without any problems. He was carrying over 18 kilograms of cocaine and nearly 1 kilogram of heroin at the time of his arrest. Despite the many questions that still hang over the alleged hijackers' activities in Venice and their connection to the drug running that was allegedly taking place at the Venice airport, an even deeper question was soon to emerge. How did these pilots, who were rated as competent at best and who, one instructor insisted, should have been further along the flight school curriculum than they were, manage to fly jumbo jets that require thousands of hours of flying experience with such precision? That question is even more important in the case of the other alleged 9/11 pilot, Hani Hanjour, the diminutive 5'5" Saudi who, the official story tells us, helped overpower grizzled Navy Top Gun honor graduate Chuck Burlingame and his flight crew at the controls of American Airlines Flight 77. According to that story, Hanjour allegedly flew a Boeing 757 with what aviation sources for the Washington Post described as extraordinary skill through a 7,000-foot spiral descent to hit the Pentagon, a move that veteran airline pilot Ed Soliday told the 9/11 Commission would be tough for any pilot, including himself, and which left one radar operator at Dulles Airport stunned. The speed, the maneuverability, the way that he turned, we all thought in the radar room, all of us experienced air traffic controllers, that was a military plane. But Honjour, by all accounts, was a completely inept pilot. He dropped out of his first flight school, the Sierra Academy of Aeronautics, after only a few classes. He then dropped out of his next school, Cockpit Resource Management in Scottsdale, Arizona, after the school's owner dismissed him as a weak student who was wasting our resources. When he returned to that school again the following year, the school owner refused, asserting, "You're never going to make it." An instructor at his next school, Sawyer Aviation, called him a neophyte who got overwhelmed with the instruments in the school's flight simulator. An instructor at his next school concurred. Honjour had no motivation, a poor understanding of the basic principles of aviation, and poor judgment, combined with poor technical skills. After bypassing the FAA to obtain a commercial pilot's license from a for-profit contractor, the operation manager at yet another flight school in the Phoenix area, Peggy Chevrette, told Fox News that Honjour was clearly unqualified to be in the cockpit. I couldn't believe that he had a license of any kind with the skills that he had. Even the New York Times conceded that the remarkable flight attributed to Honjour on 9/11 was inexplicable. In an article headlined, "A Trainee Noted for Incompetence," the paper quoted one former flight school employee who knew Honjour as saying, "I'm still to this day amazed that he could have flown into the Pentagon. He could not fly at all." Whatever the case, what would eventually become the official explanation for this seeming incongruity, namely that the single-engine aircraft training and jet simulation training that they had received was good enough for these men to jump into the cockpit of commercial jet airliners and pilot them hundreds of miles to their targets, was rejected in the first hours of the attack as completely implausible.
And meanwhile, they did spend 7 months at this flying school in Venice, according to these records. And although they were not trained to fly jets, do people believe that what they learned there was easily transferable to, say, a 757 or a 767?
Actually, no, they don't say that it's easily transferable because it's such a different type of jet. But nonetheless, they got that initial training in Venice, Florida. Whether their training continued elsewhere, you have to assume it took place somewhere else. Where they learned it, though, at this point, I don't know, and the FBI hasn't told us.
All right. Kerry Sanders, interesting development down
there. A Newsweek story of September 15th, 2001 provided one potential answer to this puzzle. According to a high-ranking U.S. Navy source cited by the report, 3 of the alleged hijackers listed their address on driver's licenses and car registrations as the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. And, according to a separate high-ranking Pentagon official, another of the alleged hijackers may have received language instruction at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. But this report, like the subsequent reports of people with the same name as the alleged hijackers turning up alive and well in the wake of 9/11, which prompted the FBI to apologize to one mistakenly named suspect, and forced FBI Director Robert Mueller to acknowledge that they were not certain of the identities of several of the named men, were eventually dismissed as mere confusion over common Arab names. On September 28, 2001, the FBI released the final list of names and photographs of the alleged hijackers, and this rogues gallery of fearsome Al Qaeda operatives was cemented in the public imagination. So who were these 19 men? If they really were who the FBI said they were, who directed them? How were they supposed to have entered the United States? How did they fund their operations? And how did they evade detection while living openly in the U.S. for months, and in some cases years? In the months after the attacks, we were told that the men identified by the FBI as the culprits had moved through Europe and America unnoticed, and that although several of them had been tracked by intelligence until they got inside the United States, they were ultimately lost. We were told that Al Qaeda's communications had been monitored, but that bin Laden and his henchmen used scramblers, internet encryption, fiber optics, so it was very hard to intercept those transmissions. And we were told that no one was to blame for the attacks, which had merely been a failure of imagination.
As we detail in our report, this was a failure of policy, management, capability, and above all, a failure of imagination.
But as the public was to learn in bits and pieces over the course of the next 2 decades. Every one of these assertions was a demonstrable lie. This alleged team of crack Al Qaeda operatives did not move through Europe and America unnoticed. Their communications were not rendered opaque to the intelligence agencies because of fiber optics. Their successful penetration of America's defenses was not due to a failure of imagination. Instead, as even the official story of the attacks now concedes, every major branch of U.S. intelligence had key pieces of information on these Al Qaeda operatives, their communications, their movements, and their plans. In fact, as can now be shown from official sources, these agencies not only deliberately allowed these operatives to proceed unmolested, but actively stopped investigators and agents within their ranks from blowing the whistle on the plot. At the FBI, Special Agent Robert Wright led an investigation into terrorist financing called Vulgar Betrayal that managed to uncover a money trail connecting a suspected Chicago terror cell to Al Qaeda. But when Wright attempted to bring criminal charges against the cell members, his supervisor flew into a rage, shouting, "You will not open criminal investigations. I forbid any of you. You will not open criminal investigations against any of these intelligence subjects." After the embassy bombings, when Wright's team began to trace the financing of the attacks to a group of Saudi businessmen, the FBI moved to shut down the investigation altogether. Wright was kicked off the case in 1999, and Vulgar Betrayal was officially shut down in 2000.
Knowing what I know, and again, this was written 91 days before the attack, knowing what I know, I can confidently say that until the investigative responsibilities for terrorism are removed from the FBI, I will not feel safe.
While Wright was pursuing the financial trail, FBI field agents across the U.S. were picking up on another trend: Muslim extremists learning to fly. Agents in Oklahoma and Phoenix both wrote memos about the large numbers of Middle Eastern males receiving flight training and warned that some of them had documentable ties to Al Qaeda, but the warnings were ignored. Agents in Minneapolis frantically sought approval for a search warrant to search the laptop of Zacharias Moussaoui, a suspected terrorist who had been receiving flight training in the area. When that request was denied, one exasperated agent told FBI headquarters that he was trying to keep someone from taking a plane and crashing into the World Trade Center. Rita Flack, an intelligence operations specialist at headquarters who had read the Phoenix memo, failed to pass that info on to any of her colleagues involved in the decision to deny the warrant to search Moussaoui's laptop. FBI whistleblower Colleen Rowley later revealed that agents in the Minneapolis office, desperately trying to find an answer to the question of why the Bureau was deliberately sabotaging the case, faced the problem with gallows humor. I know I shouldn't be flippant about this, but jokes were actually made that the key FBI HQ personnel had to be spies or moles, like Robert Hansen, who were actually working for Osama bin Laden, to have so undercut Minneapolis's effort. The Pentagon's intelligence branch, meanwhile, not only had foreknowledge of the plot, but, according to information that emerged years later and was quickly suppressed, had identified 4 of the presumed terror operatives and mapped out the network connecting them to the Brooklyn cell headed by the Blind Sheikh. Able Danger was a classified information operations campaign against transnational terrorism launched by military intelligence in the fall of 1999. First revealed to the public in June 2005, Able Danger employed data mining techniques on open source and classified information to identify networks of likely terror agents, including those operating in the U.S. The program was remarkably successful. Not only did it warn the Pentagon of an impending attack just days before the Cole bombing, as we have already seen, but, according to Defense Intelligence Agency whistleblower Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer and 4 of his colleagues working on the operation, Able Danger identified 2 of the terror cells connecting Al Qaeda to the alleged hijackers. It even identified 4 of those suspects, including Mohammed Atta, by name. When Lieutenant Colonel Schaefer tried to set up a meeting between his supervisor and FBI officials in Washington to discuss a collaborative approach to tracking these cells, he was rebuffed by lawyers for the Pentagon's Special Operations Command. Shortly thereafter, Schaefer was ordered off the Able Danger team and the unit was disbanded, with the Pentagon ordering all the Able Danger data, 2.5 terabytes worth of information, equivalent to 1/4 of all the printed material in the Library of Congress, destroyed. After a hostile investigation that left witnesses feeling intimidated into changing their story about Able Danger, still found 5 Pentagon employees who said they had seen the organizational chart with Atta's name on it, the Department of Defense Inspector General concluded that Able Danger had never identified Atta or any other alleged hijacker. And, just 2 months after the story became public, including Schaefer's revelation that he had met with 9/11 Commission Executive Director Philip Zelikow and told him all of the details of the program in an extensive hour-long debriefing in Afghanistan that did not find its way into the Commission's final report, the DIA stripped Schaefer of his security clearance, essentially ending his decades-long career as a military intelligence officer.
Good riddance.
This is not some third-rate burglary cover-up. This is not some Watergate incident. This is an attempt to prevent the American people from knowing the facts about how we could have prevented 9/11, and people are covering it up today. And they're ruining the career of a military officer to do it. Yep. And we can't let it stand.
Well, they did.
The NSA, meanwhile, despite the scrambler and fiber optics excuses of the agency's apologists, were monitoring all of the communications going through Al Qaeda's pivotal Yemen communications hub, from the lead up to the embassy bombings straight through to the execution of 9/11 itself. This communications hub, discovered in 1996 when the NSA began tapping into and transcribing the satellite phone calls of bin Laden, was, in fact, the home of Ahmed Al Qaeda, one of the jihadis who had fought alongside bin Laden against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Qaeda's phone was used by various Al Qaeda-linked operatives to pass messages to each other, as some countries blocked or monitored calls to other countries as possible terrorist communications. The NSA listened as Mohammed al-Awali, one of the bombers involved in the embassy attack, made multiple calls to the hub before and after the attack. They listened as Al Qaeda operatives called the hub to discuss attacking a U.S. warship in the months prior to the Cole bombing, and they listened as numerous terror suspects called to discuss their operations with Khalid al-Maidar, one of the alleged 9/11 hijackers and the son-in-law of Ahmed al-Hada. Thomas Drake was a decorated United States Air Force and United States Navy veteran with a background in military cryptoelectronics who had worked for 12 years as an outside contractor at the NSA. 9/11 was his first full day as an employee of the agency, and it was in the wake of that attack that he was handed a report from one of his colleagues in the NSA's counter-terror shop that laid out the agency's role in the events of that day. According to Drake, the report was an extraordinarily detailed, long-term study of Al Qaeda's activities that identified the planning cells for 9/11, including a number of the hijackers based on actual copy, Atta, Hazmi, Maidar, all of whom had appeared on the NSA's radar by the start of 2001. It also contained specific warnings about 9/11. Drake immediately gave the document to his supervisor, Maureen Baginski, who told him, "Tom, I wish you had not brought this to my attention." He was subsequently forced out of his position, stripped of his security clearance, and indicted under the Espionage Act. On the day of the attacks, knowing the information that the NSA had that could have foiled the plot, the analysts began to break down. 2 staffers suffered heart attacks, with one dying. Another, a female analyst who had been responsible for monitoring the Yemen hub communications, left NSA headquarters after suffering what Drake was told was a nervous breakdown. Yet another, a 40-something man, began openly crying in a hallway, telling 3 women he was talking to in full view of everyone passing, "We knew this was being planned months ago, but they would not let us issue the reports we wrote." NSA leadership, however, like Drake's supervisor and the head of the SIGINT division, Maureen Baginski, had a different reaction to the events unfolding that morning.
I would hear the following phrase, which I think one person in particular probably had regrets ever saying more publicly, that 9/11 was a gift to NSA. A gift.
In fact, the story of intelligence agency foreknowledge of the plot goes from the merely impossible to the outright absurd when it is revealed that it wasn't just U.S. intelligence that had a window into the plot, but every major intelligence service in the world. In subsequent years, it has emerged that intelligence agencies in Indonesia, the UK, Germany, Italy, Egypt, Russia, Jordan, France, and, of course, Israel had all passed on various warnings about an imminent attack in the months and years leading up to 9/11. And, infamously, The president received a classified intelligence briefing on August 6, 2001, that unequivocally stated that an attack was being prepared.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Rice, that the August 6 PDB warned against possible attacks in this country? And I ask you whether you recall the title of that PDB.
I believe the title was Bin Laden Determined to Attack Inside the United States.
It's no surprise that this plot, the most important ever attempted by Al Qaeda, would have been known by so many. Not only did the men that, we are told, Bin Laden handpicked for the operation make no effort to hide their movements or obscure their activities, they instead, in the words of some investigators, left a deliberate trail behind them. A trail that was picked up and extensively reported on in the immediate wake of the attacks.
Customs inspectors at Dubai Airport became suspicious when they noticed that Jarrah had pasted a page of the Quran into his passport. When they searched his luggage, they discovered piles of radical Muslim propaganda. What he did next remains a mystery to terrorism experts worldwide. He talked freely about his future plans.
One possible clue has developed in Florida. A car was towed from the Daytona Beach airport to this impound lot near Daytona. An airport worker called police because the car had photographs of Osama bin Laden in the back seat.
And that's why they geared up the FBI agents in the field immediately, and they located him in South Florida and again over on the west coast of Florida in Venice.
Were they surprised, Carrie, that he wasn't traveling under an assumed name?
I think they are, but clearly from what the indications are at this point, these terrorists are not hiding, after the fact or anything like that. I mean, I think that one of the agents told me that what he believes is that they wanted to leave this trail.
Perhaps the greatest clue as to the real nature of the 9/11 operation, however, is found in one of the most stunning pieces of evidence of direct intelligence agency complicity in the plot. In the years after the attack, it was revealed that the CIA were not just surveilling the supposed hijackers or gathering information on their plans. They actively stopped information about these men's travels from reaching other intelligence agencies, deliberately hiding the fact that 2 of these agents had entered the US and were openly living in the country from the FBI and even from the National Security Council itself for over 1.5 years. This incredible fact, buried in footnote 44 of Chapter 6 of the 9/11 Commission report, was no trivial detail. 9/11 Commission Chair Thomas Kane called it one of the most troubling aspects of our entire report. White House counterterror czar Richard Clarke said that it is evidence of both CIA malfeasance and misfeasance. And Mark Rossini, an FBI agent assigned to the CIA's Bin Laden unit, believed it to be part of a secret intelligence operation involving these supposed terrorist hijackers that the agency didn't want anyone to discover.
The agency had an obligation to tell the Bureau about these individuals, and in particular, when it was determined that they did go on to the U.S., that they did travel to America. I think they had some sort of operational plan going on that they didn't want the Bureau to know about.
Shortly after the Cole bombing, Fahad al-Qusso, a Yemeni with known links to Osama bin Laden, was interrogated by Yemeni agents and admitted that he had flown from Yemen to Bangkok the previous January to deliver $36,000 to Khalad, a terrorist based in Malaysia who Qusso identified as the bombing mastermind. The money, Qusso said, was to buy this one-legged terror mastermind an artificial leg. But Ali Soufan, the head of the FBI investigation into the Cole bombing, was puzzled by this lead. Why was Al Qaeda transferring money out of Yemen when they were supposedly planning an attack in that country? Was this money for a different operation? As with every such lead, Soufan followed up with an official request to the CIA for any information they had on Khalad in Malaysia, or the phone number that Qusso had used to contact him there. The CIA never responded to any of these official requests. But Soufan's intuitions were correct. On December 29, 1999, with all of the U.S. intelligence services on heightened alert due to the threat of Millennium terror attacks, the NSA shares information from their wiretap of Al Qaeda's Yemen communication hub with the CIA. Khalid al-Maidar, Nawaf al-Hazmi, and Salem al-Hazmi will be flying to Malaysia to attend an important Al Qaeda summit the following month. The CIA, already aware of al-Maidar's connection to the Yemen communications hub, tasks agents from 8 CIA offices and 6 friendly foreign intelligence services with tracking his travel to Malaysia. The surveillance operation is successful. When al-Maidar changes planes in Dubai, the CIA obtains a copy of his passport. Inside is a vital piece of information. This known bin Laden associate, on his way to an Al Qaeda summit, has a visa to enter the United States. A visa that was issued at the same Jeddah consulate where, Michael Springman testified, the CIA was helping to secure visas for Osama bin Laden's men during the Afghan-Soviet War. Seasoned intelligence officials have no trouble understanding the importance of this fact. Reflecting on the incredible nature of this series of events years later, veteran FBI agent Jack Clunan remarked, "How often do you get into someone's suitcase and find multiple entry visas? And how often do you know there's going to be an organizational meeting of Al Qaeda any place in the world? The chances are slim to none. This is as good as it gets. It's a home run in the 9th inning of the World Series. This is the kind of case you hope your whole life for." What happened next is so inexplicable for purveyors of the official 9/11 conspiracy theory that it is typically never discussed. After scoring this once-in-a-lifetime intelligence coup, this home run in the 9th inning of the World Series, the CIA then failed to watchlist either al-Maidar or al-Hazmi, allegedly lost track of them after they went on from Malaysia to Thailand, despite having the phone number of the hotel where they stayed in Bangkok, and failed to inform FBI investigators like Ali Soufan that these known terror associates had been tracked to an Al Qaeda summit. Most incredibly of all, the official record shows that supervisors in the CIA's bin Laden unit repeatedly and deliberately stopped agents from sending info about al-Maidar's US visa to the FBI. On January 5, 2000, while the summit was still underway in Kuala Lumpur, the CIA's Riyadh station forwarded the information about al-Maidar's visa to Alex station at Langley. Doug Miller, an FBI officer assigned to the bin Laden unit as part of an intelligence sharing program between the CIA and the FBI, read the cable and, following protocol, immediately drafted a memo asking for permission to forward the info to FBI headquarters. The reply from Miller's CIA supervisor, Michael Ann Casey, citing Alex Station's deputy chief, Tom Wilshire, was immediate and unequivocal. This is not a matter for the FBI. Thus began an 18-month odyssey in which 50 CIA personnel documentably accessed this information, and not one of them ever officially shared it with any FBI or National Security Council official, even then counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke.
You understand the way they update us at the White House is every morning I come in, I turn on my computer, and I get 100, 150 CIA reports. I'm not relying on somebody calling me and telling me things. You have to intentionally stop it. You have to intervene and say, no, I don't want that report to go. And I never got a report to that effect.
On its own, this is scarcely believable. The Central Intelligence Agency actively and deliberately made a decision to stop the automatic sharing of information on the most sensitive national security intelligence in their possession. On September 12, 2001, when the CIA finally granted Ali Soufan's request from nearly 1 year before and sent him their intelligence about the Malaysia meeting, he began visibly shaking and rushed to the bathroom, vomiting on the floor next to the toilet. When one of his colleagues asked him what had happened, he said, "They knew. They knew." But neither Soufan nor anyone else familiar with the hidden history of Al Qaeda should be surprised. When put into its context, this episode is a perfectly predictable continuation of the same pattern of intelligence agency aid that, as we have seen, defines the story of Al Qaeda. It is sometimes said that in order to be successful in their mission, the intelligence agencies have to get everything right all the time, whereas the terrorists only have to get lucky once. But the Al Qaeda terrorists, protected, shepherded, and aided by the intelligence agencies as they demonstrably were, did not get lucky once. They got lucky over and over and over again, time after time after time, year after year after year, from their earliest beginnings, through their development and growth, through their rise to international prominence, through every major terrorist attack of the 1990s, and right up to the doorstep of 9/11. At this point, the incompetence theory of failures and missed opportunities is not only not supportable, it is a transparent falsehood. There is only one conclusion possible. These terrorists were deliberately aided. This is not fringe conspiracy thinking. Even Richard Clarke eventually came to this conclusion.
For me, to this day, it is inexplicable why, when I had every other detail about everything related to terrorism, that the director didn't tell me, that the director of the Counterterrorism Center didn't tell me, that the other 48 people in CIA who knew about it never mentioned it to me or anyone in my staff in a period of over 12 months.
They were stopped from getting to you and stopped from getting to the White House.
And stopped from getting to the FBI and the Defense Department. We therefore conclude that there was a high-level decision in the CIA ordering people not to share that information.
How high level?
I would think it would have to be made by the director.
Have you asked George Tenet or Cofer Black or Richard Lee about any of this after the fact?
No.
It kind of, the facts tripped out to you over time, right, over these investigations, and then you started
Took a while.
Yeah.
So you've never approached them? What's the
But you used to be kind of buddies with Tenet, right? So
look at it this way. They've been able to get through a joint House investigation committee and get through the 9/11 Commission. And this has never come out. They got away with it. They're not going to tell you, even if you wanted more of them.
That the former top-ranking counterterrorism official in the United States has publicly accused the former director of the CIA and other top CIA officials of running an operation involving the accused 9/11 hijackers, and then covering up that operation and information about it up to and through 9/11. An incredible accusation recorded by two independent filmmakers and freely viewable on YouTube for the past decade, is apparently of so little importance that it has never been followed up on by any major media outlet. But Clarke's version of the story, explosive as it is, that these accused terrorists really were terrorists, that they, like Ali Mohammed, managed to triple-cross the intelligence agencies that were trying to use them as double agents against Al Qaeda, and that the highest ranks of those intelligence agencies, up to and including the director of the CIA, engaged in a cover-up of the entire affair, indirectly allowing 9/11 to take place purely to save their own skin, demonstrably cannot be the full story. As we now know, these 19 men were no devout Islamic fundamentalists driven by their devotion into striking against the infidels. These alcohol-drinking, strip club-attending bumblers who, at one point, lived with an FBI informant and who left what investigators described as a deliberate trail behind them, were not master spies capable of triple-crossing the CIA. They did not coordinate their plan to coincide precisely with the live-fly hijacking exercises, military war games, and planes-into-building training drills that were taking place on the day of 9/11. They did not overpower the military-trained pilots on 4 separate planes before a single one of them could so much as send out a hijack signal. They did not know to commit those hijackings precisely in the highly classified radar gaps that made their planes' movements opaque to flight traffic controllers. They did not pilot those planes through maneuvers that even experienced pilots called tough for any airline pilot, despite never having sat in the cockpit of a jumbo jet before. They did not cause 3 buildings to pulverize themselves in mid-air, falling directly through the path of most resistance at freefall gravitational acceleration with 2 planes. They did not decide to fly around the Pentagon to miss the Defense Secretary's office, and instead hit the section of the building where bookkeepers and budget analysts were working on the problem of the $2.3 trillion that Donald Rumsfeld had just 24 hours earlier admitted could not be accounted for in the Defense Department's budget. They did not commit the informed trading that 3 separate academic studies have proven did take place in the run-up to 9/11. They did not engage in the decades-long cover-up of these facts in the wake of that attack. And they did not launch the war of terror that sometimes saw the US and its allies using Al Qaeda as a convenient excuse for aggression in foreign countries, and other times saw them actively collaborating with Al Qaeda to achieve their geopolitical goals. No, Richard Clarke's story is itself a cover-up. The spectacular, catalyzing terror attack of 9/11 was not allowed to happen. It was made to happen. But why? Who, other than the devout Muslim suicide warriors posited by the official 9/11 conspiracy theorists, would do such a thing? And for what purpose? To answer these questions, we need to return to Operation Susanna and the false flag terror ruse that has been employed by the British, the Israelis, and the US throughout the past century. As we shall see, just 8 years after Operation Susanna failed in Egypt, the highest-ranking officials in the US military drafted plans to stage terror attacks, blow up airliners, and even kill Americans in order to blame their political enemies. And in the lead-up to 9/11, a cadre of political operatives brought those plans into the 21st century, paving the way for a new Pearl Harbor that would begin a worldwide war of terror and a clash of civilizations.
Our war on terror begins with Al Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Next time on the Corbett Report.
I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort against all sources of terror.
This is, in my mind, simply the legal basis for 18 years of perpetual war in the Middle East.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world. The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda.
I would go so far as to say that if they didn't have an Osama bin Laden out there, they'd invent one.
False Flags, The Secret History of Al Qaeda. Part 3, The War of Terror. Coming soon to CorbettReport.com. Previously on the Corbett Report. Meanwhile, in New York, the era of Islamic terror in the United States is about to begin.
We have a rabbi shot in a Midtown hotel.
There is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people.
We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City.
We therefore conclude that there was a high-level decision in the CIA ordering people not to share that information.
And in the lead-up to 9/11, a cadre of political operatives brought those plans into the 21st century, paving the way for a new Pearl Harbor that would begin a worldwide war of terror and a clash of civilizations.
Our war on terror begins with Al Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Kabul, Afghanistan, August 29, 2021. A white 1996 Toyota Corolla races down the dusty streets of the Afghan capital. Just days earlier, a suicide bombing at the Kabul airport had killed 13 U.S. Marines and dozens of Afghans. American forces, on high alert, track the Corolla from above. An American MQ-9 Reaper drone hovers high up, monitoring the driver, Zamari Ahmadi, as he stops at a suspected ISIS safe house and loads the car with explosives before continuing his journey to the airport. But Ahmadi never reaches his destination. At 4:50 p.m., the order is given, and the Reaper drone launches a Hellfire missile at the vehicle. Killing the would-be terrorist and destroying his explosive payload. The media in the waning hour of America's 2-decade-long military presence in Afghanistan, another terror threat has been liquidated, and more innocent lives have been saved.
Yesterday, U.S. military forces conducted an over-the-horizon counterterrorism operation against an ISIS-K planner and facilitator. The airstrike occurred in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. I can confirm, as more information has come in, that 2 high-profile ISIS targets were killed and 1 was wounded. And we know of 0 civilian casualties.
But as the smoke cleared on the scene of the strike, some grisly truths began to emerge. Ahmadi had not been a terrorist. He was not on his way to set off a suicide bomb at the Kabul airport. The car didn't even have explosives. In reality, Ahmadi had been an aid worker for an American NGO distributing food to malnourished Afghans. He wasn't on his way to the airport. He was arriving home after a day at the office. The suspicious packages that the drone operators had watched him load into his car were in fact water bottles that Ahmadi was bringing home because his neighborhood was dealing with a water shortage. In perhaps the greatest irony, Ahmadi had applied for a special visa to emigrate to the U.S. with his family just days before his death. Now, that family was devastated, torn apart by an explosion that left Ahmadi and 9 of his relatives, including a 2-year-old, dead. Finally forced to admit that every part of the drone strike story had been a lie, the Pentagon called it a tragic mistake. And, after a 3-month self-investigation, it was decided that no one involved in that mistake would receive any punishment for killing 10 innocent Afghans. The story of the killing of Zamari Ahmadi is the story of the war on terror in a nutshell. Ahmadi's death was cast as a tragic mistake for which no one was to blame, just as America's decades-long debacle in the Middle East, from the invasion, occupation, and eventual chaotic retreat from Afghanistan, to the illegal invasion of Iraq and the rise of ISIS, to the regime change operations in Libya and Syria, had been a failure of military planning. But when viewed in its proper context, the war on terror was no failure. In fact, waged on fictitious grounds against a shadowy enemy, the great military campaign of the 21st century was not a war on terror at all. It was a war of terror, a pretext for the construction of an international security grid in the name of fighting a boogeyman that never existed in the first place. And by that metric, the war of terror was successful beyond its planners' wildest dreams.
We just had a plane crash into Level 4 of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center, tower number World Trade Center now. You have a second plane into the other tower, the tower of the Trade Center transfer fire.
For many in the general public, the War on Terror was a direct consequence of 9/11. And that war began with George W. Bush's address to Congress on September 20th, 2001.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. Our war on terror begins with Al Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Some even believe that the war ended with Barack Obama's declaration of May 23rd, 2013.
It did not.
Beyond Afghanistan, we must define our effort not as a boundless global war on terror, but rather as a series of persistent, targeted efforts to dismantle specific networks of violent extremists that threaten America.
Threaten America. Like my husband, Michael.
As convenient as these statements are for creating bookends for the story of the War on Terror, they do not tell the real story of that war. In fact, the origins of the global war on terror go back much further than the general public has been led to believe. In 1962, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Lyman Lemnitzer, issued a startling proposal to President John F. Kennedy on how to get the public on board with military intervention in Cuba to remove Fidel Castro from power. Called Operation Northwoods, the plan suggested a number of staged provocations, secretly committed by the U.S. itself, but blamed on Castro, including blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming the incident on the Cuban government, staging terror attacks in the United States to be blamed on Cuban terrorists, and even painting up a remote-controlled plane to resemble a passenger jet and destroying it over Cuba. The incredible plan, rejected by Kennedy, who subsequently refused to renew Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was classified and not revealed to the public until 2001, just months before 9/11.
The idea was to create a pretext to show that there was an attack by Cuba on the United States, and the idea was to have U.S. personnel from the CIA and other places secretly create terrorism in the United States. The documents actually said people would be shot on American streets, bombs would be blown up. And again, all this, the evidence would be laid to point the finger at Castro. One other idea was they were going to, they had a very complex plan where they were going to take an aircraft and load it with CIA people that look like college students, fly it over to have it take off from an airport in Miami with a lot of publicity. And then it would quickly, after it got into the air, land at a secret CIA base. At that same time, an identical plane would take off from that CIA base, except this plane would be empty, and it'd be remotely piloted from the ground. It was a drone plane that would be very similar to the passenger plane that had just taken off. And once the plane was over Cuba, there was going to be a tape recorder that would have played a distress call into a microphone saying help were being shot at, and a few minutes later, once the plane was over the Caribbean Sea, after it passed over Cuba, it would have somebody would have pressed a button on the ground, blowing up the plane, and they would have blamed Cuba for killing a plane load of American college students.
Sorry.
But even after its rejection, the Northwoods idea of using spectacular terror attacks as the justification for a wide-scale war continued to be employed by military planners. In November 1998, Philip Zelikow, who would go on to chair the 9/11 Commission, co-wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations publication, with Ashton Carter, the future Secretary of Defense under President Obama, and John Deutsch, the former director of the CIA, titled Catastrophic terrorism, tackling the new danger.
Remember these names: Ashton Carter, John Deutsch, and Philip Zelikow. Like Dan Bongino, like I know that you are now like a deputy director, I believe it is, of the FBI. Like I mean this seriously. I know I'm Canadian. I have my top secret government clearance. I've never shared anything on my social media that has not been unclassified or declassified or open source. And so I would love to work with you. I can give you literally names. You're looking for people that are corrupt. I can give you names. I can give you and proof. So call me. I would absolutely work because, again, what helps America does help Canada too. And I think we are allies despite propaganda media I don't listen to. But anyway.
The article warns of a potential transforming event, such as an attack on the World Trade Center. Like Pearl Harbor, the event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and use of deadly force. More violence could follow, either future terrorist attacks or U.S. counterattacks. Belatedly, Americans would judge their leaders negligent for not addressing terrorism more urgently. The solution to this impending threat of catastrophic terrorism, Zelikow and his co-authors argue, is to take that threat seriously, as the U.S. government did in 1940 when it pondered what kind of forces it would need to wage a global war, and to create new offices for coordinating homeland security and waging preemptive strikes against potential terrorists around the world.
Yeah.
Then, unnoticed by much of the public, the global war on terror was first proposed on live TV on the morning of 9/11. At 11:28 a.m. New York time, as the blanket of dust from the freshly exploded towers was still settling on Manhattan, and much of the world was still trying to process what was happening, a guest on BBC World News laid out the dawning of the new age of global terror with remarkable foresight. But this prediction was not delivered by a U.S. government official or an American intelligence agent or a Washington Beltway insider. It was delivered by Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel.
Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization.
Yeah, right.
I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of Bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. The same kind of struggle that our forefathers launched against the piracy on the high seas.
In the chaos of September 11th, 2001, mere minutes after the destruction of the Twin Towers, the global viewing public were presented all the key takeaways of 9/11. That
this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States.
That
the world will not be the same from today on.
And, of course, that we
don't know who is responsible,
although
we will know in 12 hours.
But the name immediately implanted in the minds of the audience, not for the first time, nor the last time on that long day of news coverage, was that of Osama bin Laden. Yep. In the following days, these takeaways became the talking points for the U.S. government and its allies around the world. Before the day was over, President Bush was already laying the rhetorical groundwork for the coming war, vowing that
and we stand.
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. I did an exchange at West Point Military Academy. I've said this a million times. I'm proud. And, but also I have a lot of references because of that, my time there. I could not believe he got re-elected. I'm Canadian. So I wasn't fully captured or psyopsed from American propaganda. And, I just could not believe that people did not understand his family ties to being corrupt
against terrorism.
Blew my mind.
The week, the American public was being prepared for a conflict much bigger than a conventional war.
This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while.
And in the following week, Bush confirmed what the public had been told since the moment of the live televised strike on the World Trade Center.
Yeah. And on 9/11, August 3rd of 2001, that's when I joined the military. And so I was actually at CMR, which is Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, le Collège Militaire Royal. And it's like a prep CEGEP, where you do the equivalent of 2 years of CEGEP in a year. You have to have advanced science, advanced mathematics, etc., in order to even qualify to get into the program, amongst other things. But I was literally at CMR, and this is what we were watching, and it was freaking weird. I remember being in like a common room with people, and we were just like watching it, and we absolutely knew that life was going to be different. And because of all this, you're seeing that this was a staged and planned event from people within the friggin' government internationally. International government involvement. And the Patriot Act, do you realize that on our tickets, on our airline tickets, everyone, we pay fees for what they're calling the Patriot Act? So to take more freedoms and liberties away from us, despite the fact that there are people that are going on aircrafts with just a ticket, no requirement for government issued ID. And by the way, that's changed now in the last little while under Trump, is that you have to have government issued ID in order to fly. And so in places like New York and California, where it's not considered to be an official approved government document, like I'm talking about your driver's license ID, that will not be approved for airlines. So people in New York that illegally or unlawfully have friggin' driver's licenses, I've talked about this before, where even illegal immigrants are able to get driver's licenses, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to disrupt California, New York, countless other states, people within Canada as well. I think that in this case, it is like an absolute good thing. I think even for voting, I think having government issued ID is absolutely necessary. I said that even in 2021. And I said, like, if they're telling you to wear a friggin' mask to vote, do it, right? Like, who cares at that point? Just do what you're supposed to do. Like, your vote matters, and just don't make it a big dramatic thing, because there's Karens at every single voting station, and Karens will be Karens. And we all knew that the law enforcement was going to get involved, and they were going to support the Karens. And anyways, all these tangents, but just all these things coming to light.
We just saw on live television as a second plane flew into the second tower of the World Trade Center. Now, given what has been going on around the world, some of the key suspects come to mind: Osama bin Laden. Who knows what?
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
Yeah.
The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al Qaeda.
By the end of the month, the public had heard so many authoritative pronouncements about the evidence pointing to bin Laden's responsibility for the 9/11 attacks that few noticed when the US government declined to release a promised white paper outlining that evidence. A decision prompted by a lack of solid information about the plot, according to government sources cited by veteran journalist Seymour Hersh. Instead, the presentation of such evidence was outsourced, as so much of the dirty work in the global war on terror would be, to a third-party nation-state, the United Kingdom. On September 30th, 2001, UK Prime Minister Tony Blair appeared on the BBC's Breakfast with Frost program to declare he had been shown absolutely powerful, incontrovertible evidence of bin Laden's link to the events of the 11th of September. But because the evidence came from sensitive sources, he could not simply reveal it to the public. Rather, the UK government would release a report laying out its case against Osama in great detail. The dossier, titled Responsibility for the Terrorist Atrocities in the United States, was released on October 4th and was touted by the press as the clearest case yet of Osama bin Laden's involvement in the September 11 attacks. The document opens, however, by noting that it does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. The first 60 points of the report provide general background information about bin Laden and previous terror attacks attributed to Al Qaeda, and the last 10 points, dealing with Osama bin Laden and the 11 September attacks, are almost incomprehensibly vague. It claims that at least 3 of the hijackers have been identified as associates of Al Qaeda, without listing how this conclusion was arrived at or even who these associates are. It claims that the attack follows the modus operandi of Al Qaeda and is entirely consistent with the planning of previous attacks attributed to the group. And, most remarkably, it states that there is evidence of a very specific nature relating to the guilt of bin Laden and his associates that is too sensitive to release. At almost the exact same time, momentous events were taking place in Europe, where the North Atlantic Council, NATO's main decision-making body, was receiving a classified briefing from a U.S. State Department operative.
This morning, the United States briefed the North Atlantic Council on the results of their investigation into who was responsible for the horrific terrorist attacks which took place on the 11th of September. The briefing was given by Ambassador Frank Taylor, the United States State Department Coordinator on Counterterrorism. The briefing addressed the events of 11th September themselves, the results of the investigation so far, what is known about Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda organization and their involvement in the attacks and in previous terrorist activity, and the links between Al Qaeda and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The facts are clear and compelling. The information presented points conclusively to an Al Qaeda role in the 11th of September attacks.
This was no ordinary briefing. The result of that briefing was that for the first time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter, the self-defense clause that compels the organization to assist any member nation that is attacked by an outside force. By proving that bin Laden had committed the attack in connection with the Taliban, the United States could launch the war on terror and compel NATO to assist in its invasion of Afghanistan.
On the basis of this briefing, it has now been determined that the attack against the United States of America on the 11th of September was directed from abroad and shall therefore be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack on one or more of the allies in Europe or North America shall be considered as an attack against them all. I want to reiterate yet again today that the United States of America can rely on the full support of its 18 NATO allies in the campaign against international terrorism.
Given the stakes involved, questions long swirled around this mysterious classified briefing. What had Ambassador Frank Taylor told the North Atlantic Council that was so compelling? What information persuaded the world's largest and most powerful military alliance to launch an invasion of another nation? The public, it seemed, would never know.
Today's was a classified briefing, so I cannot give you all the details. Briefings are also being given directly by the United States to allies in their capitals.
But then, in 2009, IntelWire.com quietly posted a document outline under the title Secret Post 9/11 Briefing to World Leaders. The document is a U.S. State Department cable addressed to the American embassies in the NATO countries and American allies around the world under the subject line, September 11, Working Together to Fight the Plague of Global Terrorism and the Case Against Al Qaeda. The cable is dated October 1, 2001, the day before Ambassador Taylor's meeting with the North Atlantic Council, and instructs its recipients to brief their host country's government on the information linking the Al Qaeda terrorist network, Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban regime to the September 11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, and the crash of United Airlines Flight 93. The document went largely unnoticed until 2018, when Professor Niels Harrit wrote an article, The Mysterious Frank Taylor Report, the 9/11 document that launched US-NATO's war on terrorism in the Middle East, connecting the dots between this document and the briefing that Ambassador Taylor gave to the North Atlantic Council.
This is, in my mind, with no doubt, simply the legal basis for 18 years of perpetual war in the Middle East. This is the basis for NATO's activation of Article 5. And so what is in the document? What is the evidence? What is the evidence which Lord Robertson calls clear and compelling? None. There's absolutely no evidence in that paper.
Much like the UK government dossier, the State Department cable contains no actual evidence of a link between bin Laden and the 9/11 attacks. In fact, the cable is virtually identical to the UK report. After spending a full 15 pages talking in generalities about terror, about the US government's officially sanctioned history of Al Qaeda, and of previous attacks attributed to Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, the document finally arrives at Part 3, purporting to demonstrate Al Qaeda's involvement in the attacks. But Part 3 begins by admitting that the investigation into the attacks is still in the early stage, and that there are still gaps in our knowledge. It then goes on to detail circumstantial evidence, including the observation that bin Laden and his associates seemed to be anticipating what we could only identify as an important event or activity. Finally, the document talks about how the incident is tactically similar to earlier attacks, because it involved planning and a desire to inflict mass casualties. And with that complete lack of evidence, the war on terror was launched, and the invasion of Afghanistan began.
Yep.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al Qaeda terrorist training camps in Afghanistan.
The night sky over Afghanistan lights up with thunderous explosions.
The U.S. and a broad coalition of countries against terrorism in general. The most immediate objective, to hunt down and root out Osama bin Laden and his terrorist cells.
And so, in October 2001, the bombs began dropping on Afghanistan. The war of terror had officially begun, and the public was told that one of the key objectives of that war was to kill or capture Osama bin Laden.
Mr. More bin Laden dead.
I want him held. I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said "Wanted, dead or alive."
But as we have seen, one of the defining hallmarks of Al Qaeda throughout its reign of terror was its agents' uncanny ability to cross borders illegally, evade capture repeatedly, and generally slip through intelligence agency dragnets unimpeded. This remarkable string of good luck included the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who entered the US with CIA support and lived there unmolested even after his green card was revoked. World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, who entered the US without the proper paperwork, working and living with a suspected terror ring that was under FBI surveillance, and fleeing the country before he was even a person of interest in the WTC investigation. Khalid al-Maidar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, whose entry to the US from an Al Qaeda summit in Malaysia was known about and actively covered up by the CIA, and who lived openly in the United States under their real names for over a year, repeatedly calling the Al Qaeda communications hub in Yemen that was being monitored by the NSA. And, most infamously, Al Qaeda triple agent Ali Mohammed, whose career as an Egyptian army officer, a failed CIA asset, a trusted aide to Al Qaeda second-in-command Ayman al-Zawahiri, a U.S. Special Forces training officer, a volunteer fighter in Afghanistan, an FBI deep cover asset, Osama bin Laden's personal bodyguard, and the trainer of many of Al Qaeda's terrorists throughout the 1990s, is so improbable that it is generally ignored in most histories of Al Qaeda. As incredible as all of those stories are, however, they pale in comparison to the story that was about to unfold: the disappearance of Osama bin Laden, ostensibly the most wanted man on the planet, from under the noses of the American military and intelligence services. Osama bin Laden's remarkable post-9/11 disappearance actually began on 9/11 itself, when his whereabouts were not a mystery to America or its allies in the region. In fact, his location and activities on the night before 9/11 were well known to the US, although that information would not be revealed to the public until after his escape.
Everyone remembers what happened on September 11. Here's the story of what may have happened the night before. It is a tale as twisted as the hunt for Osama bin Laden. CBS News has been told that the night before the September 11th terrorist attack, Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. He was getting medical treatment with the support of the very military that days later pledged its backing for the U.S. war on terror in Afghanistan. Pakistan intelligence sources tell CBS News that bin Laden was spirited into this military hospital in Rawalpindi for kidney dialysis treatment.
Despite knowing bin Laden's precise location and activities right up to the moment of 9/11, however, and despite the fact that the Al Qaeda leader was already a wanted fugitive subject to international arrest warrants and under indictment by a U.S. federal court, bin Laden continued to move around internationally with the full knowledge and complicity of state intelligence services. And, as remarkable as this may seem, bin Laden's trip to Rawalpindi on the eve of 9/11 was neither the first nor the last time that the U.S. would allow him to evade capture. In the weeks after the attack, the Taliban offered to try bin Laden in Afghanistan, or even hand him over to a third-party country if the U.S. provided them with the same proof of bin Laden's guilt for 9/11 that Ambassador Taylor had supposedly provided NATO. Bush turned the offer down. Then, after the invasion of Afghanistan began in October, the Taliban again tried to hand bin Laden over, this time dropping the request for proof of his guilt. Bush again refused. The war of terror, it turned out, was not about getting Osama. In fact, if bin Laden had been captured or killed, it would have derailed the carefully laid plans for the Bush administration's aggressive new foreign policy. But, having been sold on the simplified version of the war on terror, the one that held the objective of that war was to kill or capture Osama bin Laden and to liquidate the Al Qaeda network, the public believed that the fighting would be short and decisive, like the First Gulf War. After all, how hard would it be for the army of the world's unrivaled military superpower, employing the tools of the most high-tech intelligence community in history, to capture a lone fighter on dialysis in the caves of Tora Bora? Bush administration officials were quick to temper the public's expectations on this point. This was no ordinary elderly man living in an undefended cave, after all. This was a comic book supervillain, an evil millionaire mastermind directing a terrorist army from his elaborate cave fortress.
There was constant discussion about him hiding out in caves, and I think many times the American people have a perception that it's a little hole dug out of the side of a mountain. Oh no, this is it. This is a fortress, yes. A complex, multi-tiered, bedrooms and offices on the top, as you can see, secret exits on the side and on the bottom, cut deep to avoid thermal detection, a ventilation system to allow people to breathe and to carry on. The entrance is large enough to drive trucks and even tanks, even computer systems and telephone systems. It's a very sophisticated operation.
Oh, you bet. This is serious business. And there's not one of those. There are many of those.
This was a lie, of course. There were no high-tech cave fortresses, no multi-tiered bedrooms and offices on the top, no secret exits on the side, no ventilation systems or computer systems. It was a fabrication, a literal artist's rendering with as much reality as that of a comic book or a cartoon. But, as an unfolding drama for the public following the war on their television sets half a world away, this story had enough twists and turns to keep any audience engaged. The first phase of the war went as predicted. By November, America's relentless bombing had already routed the Taliban, driving them from Kabul toward Kunduz in the north. There, the trapped fighters, including not only Taliban but Al Qaeda members, as well as Pakistani army officers, intelligence advisors, and volunteers, were saved from certain defeat by a miracle: the arrival of a squadron of Pakistani aircraft that flew in and airlifted them back to Pakistan. It was later confirmed that the operation, dubbed the Airlift of Evil, was signed off on by the Bush administration, who had cut a secret deal with Pakistani President Musharraf to let the fighters escape, and who ordered the United States Central Command to set up a special air corridor to help ensure the safety of the Pakistani rescue flights. But what about Osama bin Laden? As it turns out, his whereabouts were no great mystery to American forces, and, once again, he was allowed to escape. On the eve of the invasion of Afghanistan in October, The Guardian reported that Osama bin Laden was in Kabul last week, and US and British intelligence agencies have a pretty good idea where he is now, suggesting that Western intelligence has a much clearer picture of bin Laden's recent movements than has been admitted. The report went on to note that bin Laden's capture or death would reduce the pressure for wider military action against Afghanistan. But this intelligence did not lead to bin Laden's apprehension. As American forces honed in on Kabul in early November, bin Laden and all of his closest advisors managed to escape to Jalalabad in a very conspicuous late-night convoy. One eyewitness reported, "We don't understand how they weren't all killed the night before, because they came in a convoy of at least 1,000 cars and trucks. It was a very dark night, but it must have been easy for American pilots to see the headlights." On November 13th, just one day before the Northern Alliance captured Jalalabad, bin Laden escaped once again, this time in a convoy of several hundred cars. Despite believing bin Laden to be in one of the vehicles, US forces opted to ignore the convoy and instead bombed the nearby Jalalabad airport. Bin Laden and his men, now numbering a few hundred fighters, arrived in mid-November at the mountainous Khyber Pass on the border of Pakistan. On November 15th, with the remaining Al Qaeda and Taliban holdouts pinned down in the caves of Tora Bora, the US military was in a position to eliminate the Al Qaeda threat, kill Osama bin Laden, and end the war on terror. But, remarkably, the Marines, Special Forces, and CIA operatives who were positioned and ready to do this were blocked from doing so by their own superiors.
That winter, the CIA was still at war. The Taliban had fallen. Now it was Osama bin Laden's turn.
I'm looking for bin Laden right away. I want to start killing him and his people immediately.
We had intelligence that continued to develop that bin Laden and Zawahiri were in Afghanistan, probably in the eastern areas, hiding out there.
The CIA tried to put together a team to chase bin Laden. It wasn't easy.
I asked Army Special Forces if they'll send people in. They say, no, we're not going down there. It's unstable. You don't have a reliable ally.
The conditions for Al Qaeda's retreat were quite favorable, and the United States did not do the one thing that the Pentagon had within its power to do, which was to move regular U.S. troops into a blocking position behind these mountains.
The story, exhaustively documented by CIA operatives, Special Forces operators, journalists, and even a U.S. Senate report, is clear and unambiguous. As the U.S. Senate report notes, by early December 2001, bin Laden's world had shrunk to a complex of caves and tunnels carved into a mountainous section of eastern Afghanistan known as Tora Bora. Both the CIA and Delta Force, the U.S. Army's elite Special Operations Unit, had tracked bin Laden from Jalalabad to Tora Bora. They had real-time eavesdropping capabilities on Al Qaeda almost from their arrival, allowing them to track movements and gauge the effectiveness of the bombing, and were able to pick up radio communications featuring bin Laden directly issuing commands to his troops. They had him surrounded on three sides, and the relentless airstrikes, including the use of a 15,000-pound daisy cutter not used since Vietnam, were decimating what was left of bin Laden's forces. All that was needed was to secure the mountain pass leading out of Tora Bora and into Pakistan. Gary Bernson, the head of the CIA's paramilitary operation against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, knew that the Afghan militias that the US had cobbled together were not up to the job of securing the pass. From mid-November to mid-December, he repeatedly begged his superiors for 1 battalion of US Army Rangers, just 800 troops, to help stop bin Laden from slipping away. As the US Senate later noted, fulfilling Bernson's request would have been a manageable task. In late November, about the time US intelligence placed bin Laden squarely at Tora Bora, more than 1,000 members of the 15th and 26th Marine Expeditionary Units, among the military's most mobile arms, established a base southwest of Kandahar, only a few hours' flight away. Another 1,000 troops from the Army's 10th Mountain Division were split between a base in southern Uzbekistan and Bagram Air Base, a short helicopter flight from Tora Bora. General James Mattis, the commander of the Marines at Kandahar, told a journalist that his troops could seal off Tora Bora, but but his superiors rejected the plan. Berntsen fared no better in his quest to obtain 800 Army Rangers for the mission. Not only was his request rejected, but, remarkably, in the middle of the most important battle of the war, he was replaced as head of the CIA force in Afghanistan, effective immediately. His replacement was to be Rich Blee, the same CIA bin Laden unit chief who had helped conceal the information about al-Maidar and al-Hazmi's entry to the US from the FBI. Blee was accompanied to Afghanistan by Michael N. Casey, the bin Laden unit staffer who had actually stopped Doug Miller from sharing that info with the FBI. At first, Berntsen was told that his request was denied because it might alienate our Afghan allies. "I don't give a damn about alienating our allies," he replied. "I only care about eliminating Al Qaeda and delivering bin Laden's head in a box." Later, though, a different story emerged. As it turns out, at the exact same time that bin Laden was holed up in Tora Bora, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld ordered General Tommy Franks, who was leading the Afghan invasion, to redirect planning resources from Afghanistan to the Pentagon's next target in the War of Terror, Iraq. As even the official story of the War on Terror acknowledges, bin Laden and his top aides, seizing their opportunity, simply walked out of Tora Bora and into Pakistan. And, just like that, the boogeyman of the War on Terror was gone, allowed to escape yet again. He would reappear from time to time to continue reminding the public about the origins of the terror war. But now, the public's attention was being turned to a new boogeyman.
Mr. President, in your speeches now, you rarely talk or mention Osama bin Laden. Why is that? Also, can you tell the American people if you have any more information, if you know if he is dead or alive? Final part here. Deep in your heart, don't you truly believe that until you find out if he is dead or alive, you won't really eliminate the threat of it?
Well, deep in my heart, I know the man's on the run if he's alive at all. And who knows if he's hiding in some cave or not. We hadn't heard from him in a long time. And the idea of focusing on one person is really indicates to me people don't understand the scope of the mission. Terror is bigger than one person. And he's a person who's now been marginalized. His network is, his host government has been destroyed. He's the ultimate parasite who found weakness, exploited it, and met his match. He is, as I mentioned in my speeches, I do mention the fact that this is a fellow who is willing to commit youngsters to their death, and he himself tries to hide if in fact he's hiding at all. So I don't know where he is. Nor do I just don't spend that much time on it, Kelly, to be honest with you. Some have argued that confronting the threat from Iraq could detract from the war against terror. To the contrary, confronting the threat posed by Iraq is crucial to winning the war on terror.
That the Bush administration would pivot so quickly from hunting Osama bin Laden to toppling Saddam Hussein was only surprising to those who did not know the neocons populating the Bush administration, or their well-documented and long-held desire to effect regime change in Iraq. In 1996, a group of prominent neoconservatives, including Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wurmser, wrote a report for then-Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, titled "A Clean Break, A New Strategy for Securing the Realm." The report urged Israel to shape its strategic environment by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. The way to do this, the report concluded, was to focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambitions. In 1997, 25 prominent neocons, including 10 who would go on to serve in the Bush administration, and even Jeb Bush, the future president's brother, signed a statement of principles as the founding charter of a new think tank called the Project for the New American Century. The statement called on then-President Clinton to reverse the defense spending cuts that marked the post-Cold War era and to increase defense spending significantly. In 1998, the group followed up with an open letter to Clinton urging him to turn your administration's attention to implementing a strategy for removing Saddam's regime from power. Surrounding himself with neocons on the campaign trail, and eventually installing those neocons in all of the key security positions in his cabinet, President George W. Bush wasted no time in making these regime change dreams a reality. As Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill later revealed, at his first major National Security Council meeting, held just 10 days into the new administration, President Bush tasked Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Hugh Shelton to begin preparing options for the use of U.S. ground forces in the northern and southern no-fly zones in Iraq to support an insurgency to bring down the Saddam regime. The second National Security Council meeting of the Bush administration, held 2 days later, also discussed regime change in Iraq, with one briefing document at the meeting marked secret and bearing the title, Plan for Post-Saddam Iraq.
From the very first instance, it was about Iraq. It was about what we can do to change this regime.
Everybody else thought that grew out of 9/11.
No.
But this book says it was day one of this administration.
Day one, these things were laid and sealed.
And, infamously, on the day of 9/11 itself, the administration was already beginning plans for a retaliatory strike not just on bin Laden in Afghanistan, but on Iraq. A note taken at 2:40 p.m. on September 11, 2001, records Rumsfeld saying he wanted best info fast, judge whether good enough to hit Saddam Hussein at the same time, not only bin Laden. He made sure to order staff to go massive and sweep it all up, including things related and not. From before Bush even got into office, there was no doubt that he would attack Iraq. 9/11 and the War on Terror merely presented the neocons with the perfect opportunity to fulfill that agenda. The only problem was how to tie Iraq into the War on Terror in the minds of the public, a problem that Bush himself admitted to.
It's, one of the hardest parts of my job is to connect Iraq to the War on Terror. Of course we're after Saddam Hussein, bin Laden. He's isolated.
He's an idiot. He's an
The job
absolute
of connecting
idiot.
the public
And he
face of
thinks
the
he's
War on
elite.
Terror, bin Laden and Al Qaeda, to Saddam and Iraq, was made more difficult by the fact that there was no such connection. Difficult, but not impossible for a committed cadre with no qualms about using mendacity to achieve their political objectives. The most direct link between Al Qaeda and Iraq was a trip that alleged 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta was reported to have made to the Iraqi consulate in Prague in April 2001. After Atta's pictures were published in the media in the wake of 9/11, a Middle East informant told Czech intelligence that he had seen Atta meeting with a suspected Iraqi intelligence agent in the Czech Republic that spring. The story became even more salacious when, at the height of the anthrax scare in October 2001, anonymous Israeli intelligence sources planted a story in the German media that Atta had in fact received anthrax spores from his Iraqi contact in Prague. But the entire story was such a preposterous lie that it was quickly disowned by both the FBI and the CIA. Investigators found there was no evidence Atta left or returned to the US during that time frame, and pointed to other evidence, including Atta's cell phone records, to cast doubt on the idea that any meeting had occurred. And, despite the fantastical, anonymous, evidence-free reports in German media, the anthrax used in the anthrax attacks on America in the fall of 2001 did not source from Iraq, but from the US military's own bioweapons laboratory. None of this stopped Vice President Dick Cheney from repeating the lie in his media appearances in the run-up to the Iraq War, however.
We've seen in connection with the hijackers, of course,
Such a
Mohammed
liar.
Atta, who was the lead hijacker, did apparently travel to Prague on a number of occasions. And on at least one occasion, we have reporting that places him in Prague with a senior Iraqi intelligence official a few months before the attack on the World Trade Center.
The story of Iraqi agents handing flasks of anthrax to 9/11 hijackers was a little too fanciful even for the credulous American public, however, and it was soon dropped from the neocon sales pitch for the Iraq War. Instead, a different set of lies would need to be found to sell the public on the illegal invasion of a sovereign nation. On January 31st, 2003, 6 months after senior British intelligence complained behind closed doors that the facts were being fixed around the policy of invading Iraq, Bush met with British Prime Minister Tony Blair at the White House for a discussion on the matter. As a now infamous memo documenting the meeting records, Bush had already decided on military action, and a start date for the bombing of March 10th was now penciled in. Given that it was unlikely that the UN would pass a resolution authorizing the invasion absent some compelling incident, Bush suggested a way that Iraq could be provoked into aggressive action. According to the memo, the US was thinking of flying U-2 reconnaissance aircraft with fighter cover over Iraq painted in UN colors. If Saddam fired on them, he would be in breach of existing UN resolutions, thus justifying military action. The stunning and documented admission that President Bush had suggested staging a false flag event as one option for provoking a war received some press attention at the time, but has since largely been forgotten. After all, they did not need to get Iraq to shoot down a spy plane. The neocons had hit on a different strategy for selling the war to the public.
If the Iraqi regime wishes peace, it will immediately and unconditionally forswear, disclose, and remove or destroy all weapons of mass destruction.
One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. He now is trying, through his illicit procurement network, to acquire the equipment he needs to be able to enrich uranium. Aluminum tubes. Specifically aluminum tubes. There's a story in the New York Times this morning.
The problem here is that there will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon. But we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
As these drawings, based on their description, show, we know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work. And we know a great deal about the platforms on which they are mounted.
And my message to Saddam Hussein is that for the sake of peace, for the sake of freedom, you must disarm like you said you would do. But my message to you all and to the country is this. For the sake of our future freedoms and for the sake of world peace, if the United Nations can't act, and if Saddam Hussein won't act, the United States will lead a coalition of nations to disarm Saddam Hussein.
As decades of after-the-fact journalism has exhaustively documented, every aspect of the weapons of mass destruction story was a transparent and admitted lie. But it was a remarkably successful lie. 6 months into the Iraq War, a stunning 82% of the American public believed that Saddam Hussein had provided assistance to Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and 69% believed that Saddam was personally involved in the September 11th attacks. As the months wore on, however, it became harder to hide the fact that the mythical WMD stashes and mobile weapons labs and aluminum tubes that the public had been assured were keys to the imminent threat posed by Saddam's regime simply weren't there. Even the corporate press that had worked so hard to sell these lies to the public had to start pointing out the obvious. The Bush administration had lied in order to sell an illegal invasion of a sovereign country to the American public and to the people of the world. The neocons realized that a renewed effort was going to be needed to connect Iraq to the war on terror in order to keep the public on board with the war as the invasion of Iraq morphed into the occupation of Iraq. And, as always, the Al Qaeda threat would serve the purpose of terrifying the public into rallying once again behind their government. The fact that Iraq and Al Qaeda were mortal enemies might have been an insurmountable obstacle to anyone concerned with the truth. But these were neocons. Their logic was simple. If the Al Qaeda boogeyman didn't exist in Iraq, they would have to create it. So that's exactly what they did.
And now to Iraq, where a series of suicide bombings ripped through the country again today, killing at least 48 people.
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's Al Qaeda offshoot claimed responsibility.
The United States this morning is promising to help Iraq fight off a new Al Qaeda offensive.
Founded in Jordan in 1999, even the official history of the terrorist organization that became known as Al Qaeda in Iraq acknowledges that the group originally had nothing to do with either Al Qaeda or Iraq. Instead, its founder, Ahmed Al Qaeda, was a Jordanian militant whose terror cell, Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, or Congregation of Monotheism and Jihad, was dedicated to the overthrow of the Jordanian monarchy. Like many of the figures in the Al Qaeda story, the biography of Al Qaeda is not that of a devout Muslim, let alone a dedicated jihadi. A high school dropout, Al Qaeda was known for drunken brawls and drug dealing, and was jailed for sexual assault before going to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen in 1989, just as the Soviets were leaving. From there, the story of this soon-to-be-feared terrorist leader tells us he returned to Jordan a few years later, founded a terror cell known as Jund al-Sham that attracted the attention of the authorities, and was sent to prison in 1992, where he adopted more radical Islamic beliefs. After his release from Jordanian prison in 1999, he immediately became involved in a new plot to bomb the Radisson SAS Hotel in Amman and several tourist sites in Jordan just before New Year's Day 2000. The plot was foiled, and Al Qaeda fled through Pakistan to Afghanistan, where, we are told, he met with bin Laden and other Al Qaeda leaders, with whose assistance he set up a terrorist training camp for Jordanian militants in Herat. Joining the resistance to the U.S. invasion after 9/11 and adopting the nom de guerre Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, he fled to Iran in January 2002. His whereabouts and activities during 2002 are difficult to pin down, but Western and Arab intelligence agencies assured the Washington Post that, despite being a known terror operative and wanted by numerous governments, Zarqawi, like many other Al-Qaeda figures, moved frequently and with relative ease among Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, expanding his network. Then, in 2003, still a relative unknown even within the world of militant jihad, Zarqawi turned up in Baghdad, where he was catapulted to international infamy, not by his actions, nor by the promotion of Osama bin Laden or other jihadis, but by the U.S. government.
But what I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the Al Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda lieutenants.
The remarks, delivered during Colin Powell's infamous speech justifying the forthcoming invasion of Iraq to the UN Security Council in February of 2003, were, like most of the specific accusations in the address, demonstrably false. Zarqawi was a relative nobody in Iraq at the time. The CIA later admitted there was no evidence that Hussein had been harboring him, and his group was not, in fact, affiliated with Al Qaeda when Powell made his speech. Nevertheless, these falsehoods started to become true after the spotlight of attention was showered on Zarqawi by the U.S. State Department. Attacks attributed to or claimed by Zarqawi were relatively few, but received inordinate amounts of attention from the international press. These attacks were often designed to inflame Shia-Sunni hatred, thus turning resistance to the occupation into a full-on sectarian conflict that tore the country to its roots. And in 2004, Zarqawi, who, we are told, calculated that attaching the Al Qaeda brand name to his group would give it more cachet in the jihadi world, pledged his allegiance to Osama bin Laden and received the Al Qaeda title Emir of Al Qaeda in the Country of Two Rivers. The specter of Al Qaeda in Iraq, just another cynical and calculated lie when used by Powell to justify the Iraq invasion, had become a reality. What resulted from this U.S. government-promoted character was a career so remarkable that it could only be believed in a Hollywood action movie, or a history of Al Qaeda. In 2004, after being allegedly caught and freed by Iraqi security forces in the Fallujah area because they didn't realize who he was, Zarqawi was then reportedly killed in an American bombing raid in northern Iraq in March, before pledging his allegiance to Osama and officially joining Al Qaeda in October. In 2005, Zarqawi was, according to various sources, arrested in Bakuba in January, left seriously injured, possibly dead, after a US-led offensive in May, evacuated to a neighboring country with the help of doctors from the Arab Peninsula and the Sudan, killed in fighting in Ramadi in June and buried in Fallujah, and killed again in a terrorist bombing in Mosul in November. This remarkable career finally came to an end when, we are told, Zarqawi had been killed yet again, and presumably for good, in June of 2006.
The lead aircraft is going to engage it here momentarily with a 500-pound bomb on the target.
2 bombs dropped by an American F-16 strike home. A house outside Bakuba, north of Baghdad, is flattened. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq and one of the world's most wanted men, has been eliminated. Iraqi police, who've lost hundreds of comrades in attacks blamed on Zarqawi, are celebrating. The White House is relieved.
Now Zarqawi has met his end, and this violent man will never murder again.
But not everyone believed that this final account of Zarqawi's death was the true one. Rather than simply mistakes in reporting, other members of the Iraqi resistance insisted that Zarqawi had in fact been killed early on in the US invasion, and that his name was simply being used to create an excuse for the continued American occupation of the country. Sheikh Jawad al-Khalesi, a noted Shiite imam in Baghdad, was quoted in Le Monde as saying, "I don't think Abu Musab al-Zarqawi exists. He died in northern Iraq at the beginning of the war. His family even conducted a funeral ceremony in Jordan. Since then, his name has been nothing but a toy, an excuse used by Americans to stay in Iraq." Al-Khalesi was not the only one with his doubts about Zarqawi's true nature. The Project on Defense Alternatives of the Commonwealth Institute in Massachusetts released a report in 2004 excoriating the US government for its propaganda attempting to portray Zarqawi as a terrorist leader in Iraq. The evidence offered to support the administration's assessment of Zarqawi as a driver of the Iraqi insurgency and top lieutenant of bin Laden is reminiscent, in form and substance, of the spurious evidence regarding Iraq weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, some of the sources may be the same. Similarly, the Financial Times, the Telegraph, Knight Ridder newspapers, the Los Angeles Times, and Newsweek all published stories in 2004 calling various aspects of the Zarqawi myth into question. A report in the Telegraph in 2006 called him a figurehead around whom dissident groups in Iraq were rallying, rather than an elusive fighter directing military operations, noting that the more the Americans blamed al-Zarqawi for terrorist atrocities, the greater his credibility on the Arab street, and quoting an unnamed Sunni insurgent leader as calling Zarqawi an American, Israeli, and Iranian agent who is trying to keep our country unstable so that the Sunnis will keep facing occupation. According to The Atlantic, even Osama bin Laden himself suspected that the group of Jordanian prisoners with whom al-Zarqawi had been granted amnesty in 1998 had been infiltrated by Jordanian intelligence. And then, right before he was reported dead for the last time, skeptics of the Zarqawi narrative were proven right in a remarkable fashion. On April 9, 2004, the Washington Post published proof in the form of internal military documents that the US government had played up the myth of Zarqawi and Al Qaeda in Iraq as part of a psychological operations campaign. The US military is conducting a propaganda campaign to magnify the role of the leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq, according to internal military documents and officers familiar with the program. For the past 2 years, US military leaders have been using Iraqi media and other outlets in Baghdad to publicize Zarqawi's role in the insurgency. The documents explicitly list the US home audience as one of the targets of a broader propaganda campaign. In case there was any doubt that the propaganda campaign was targeted at Americans, the program included the Pentagon selectively leaking a letter to a US reporter purported to be written by Zarqawi and boasting of his role in the wave of suicide attacks terrorizing Iraq. The letter was dutifully covered by the New York Times, even though there were serious questions about whether it was real at all. The Washington Post expose quotes an internal briefing document produced by U.S. military headquarters in Iraq, revealing that U.S. military chief spokesman Brigadier General Mark Kimmett boasted that the Zarqawi PSYOP program is the most successful information campaign to date. And then, 2 months after these explosive revelations, Zarqawi was reported dead for the last time, a character written out of the script once his value as a propaganda construct was exhausted. With Zarqawi out of the picture, something else would be required to keep the American public and the people of the world invested in the war on terror. The main villain in the battle would have to return. Thankfully for the US government, Osama bin Laden was only too happy to oblige.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. تحية الأحزاب وأثار الأشجار.
From the time of his miraculous escape from Tora Bora on, the outside world only knew Osama bin Laden from his occasional video releases. The most infamous of these productions was a video released to the public by the US Defense Department on December 13, 2001. Supposedly obtained in Afghanistan during the search of a private home in Jalalabad after anti-Taliban forces moved into the city. The tape, we are told, bore a label indicating it was made on November 9, and shows bin Laden sitting on the floor in a bare room in a house in Kandahar with several other men, including 2 aides and an unidentified cleric or sheikh. Most importantly, it contains, according to the Pentagon-provided subtitles that were added to the video before its distribution to the press, bin Laden's confession to planning the 9/11 attacks. We had notification since the previous Thursday that the event would take place that day. The US government translation has bin Laden saying, "We calculated in advance the number of casualties from the enemy who would be killed based on the position of the tower." The press release provided by the Pentagon noted that, due to the poor quality of the tape, they were not able to produce a verbatim transcript, but that their translation does convey the messages and information flow of the conversation, an answer that was apparently good enough for the White House press corps.
Ari, on the bin Laden video that the government released last week, can you offer assurances that the omissions in the government-supplied translation were not deliberate?
Mark, I think Secretary Rumsfeld addressed that very eloquently earlier today when he said, number one, this tape doesn't change anything, or this translation doesn't change anything about the facts in the case. The Department of Defense translators worked very diligently on a very short timetable to put together a faithful translation, and that's what they did. And if you note on the cover note of what the Department of Defense put out, they wrote, "Due to the quality of the original tape, it is not a verbatim transcript of every word spoken during the meeting, but does convey the messages and the information flow." So I think what you saw was the very best effort possible. And as the Secretary said about the translation of Arabic, it's not a precise art that is agreed to by every translator.
But this answer was not sufficient for the foreign press. The following week, German TV channel Das Erste broadcast an edition of their investigative program, Monitor, in which they hired their own independent translators to check the Pentagon's transcript of the tape. The report calls the Pentagon translation very problematic, noting that at the most important places where it is held to prove the guilt of bin Laden, it is not identical with the Arabic. Translator Dr. Murad Alami, for instance, found that in the sentence, "We calculated in advance the number of casualties from the enemy," the words "in advance" had simply been inserted by the US government translators. Those words did not appear on the tape. Similarly, the word "previous" in "We had notification since the previous Thursday," and the subsequent statement that an event would take place on that day cannot be heard in the original Arabic version. The Monitor report concludes that the Pentagon translation of Osama bin Laden's supposed confession tape, deliberately adding words in key passages to make it sound like a confession, was not only inaccurate, but actually manipulative. As Gernot Rotter, a professor of Islamic and Arabic Studies at the Asia-Africa Institute at the University of Hamburg, states in the report, the American translators who listened to the tapes and transcribed them apparently wrote a lot of things in that they wanted to hear, but that cannot be heard on the tape no matter how many times you listen to it. The startling revelation that the Osama bin Laden confession tape was not a confession tape at all, aired on Germany's premier public broadcaster and widely discussed in the German press, was never reported in the US. That video was followed in short order by a 30-minute video of a visibly gaunt and graying Osama bin Laden delivering what appears to be a last message to the Arab world. Released on December 27, 2001, and presumably recorded during the fight at Tora Bora, bin Laden comments on his own mortality. God willing, America's end is near, and it doesn't depend on my continued existence. Whether Osama is killed or not, the awakening has begun. In the 30-minute video, bin Laden does not move his left arm at all and appears visibly weak. Interested at that moment in turning the public's attention away from Osama bin Laden and toward the next front in the war on terror, Iraq, the Bush administration dismissed the video as sick propaganda, possibly designed to mask the fact that the Al Qaeda leader was already dead. He could have made the video and then ordered that it be released in the event of his death, the Telegraph quoted one White House aide as saying. The guy is trying to show he's untouched by the US bombing, but he looks under pressure to me. Recorded months after his reported journey to Rawalpindi for kidney dialysis, this video would not be the first or the last time that Osama bin Laden would be reported as dead or dying. Like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, bin Laden was also reported dead on several occasions in the ensuing years, including on December 26, 2001, when it was reported that Osama bin Laden had died from a serious lung complication in Tora Bora. On January 18, 2002, when Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf told CNN, "I think now, frankly, he is dead for the reason he is a kidney patient." In September 2006, when French intelligence leaked a report suggesting bin Laden had died of typhoid fever in Pakistan. And in March 2009, when former U.S. Foreign Intelligence Officer Angelo Codevilla stated, "All the evidence suggests Elvis Presley is more alive today than Osama bin Laden." But, also like Zarqawi, none of these reported deaths stopped the Osama bin Laden character from reappearing on the TV screens of a traumatized public to remind them of the importance of the ongoing war on terror. What followed in the ensuing years was a series of video and audio releases of questionable provenance, often reported in carefully worded turns of phrase that gave the press plausible deniability as to whether or not the recordings really were of Osama bin Laden. A message aired on Al Jazeera in February 2003, for instance, was reported by the BBC as a poor-quality audio recording in which a man's voice, identified as bin Laden's, is heard calling for suicide attacks against Americans and resistance to any attack on Iraq. The recordings were often mundane. An April 2006 audio message of a speaker believed to be Osama bin Laden called on Muslims to prepare for a long war in Sudan. A January 2010 audio message warned of the dangers of climate change. Talk about climate change is not an ideological luxury, but a reality, the speaker, purportedly bin Laden, told his fellow jihadis. Other recordings appeared at opportune times for the planners of the war on terror, catapulting the terror threat back into the public consciousness just when questions about that narrative were beginning to emerge. The 2004 U.S. presidential election contest between George Bush and John Kerry, for instance, featured an unusual October surprise. A new Osama bin Laden videotape, in which the terror mastermind appears to claim responsibility for 9/11 and to warn the American public of future strikes.
This is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. With just 4 days left in the presidential campaign, Osama bin Laden suddenly dropped himself right in the middle of it with a videotaped message to the people of the United States. The fugitive Al Qaeda leader admits for the first time that he indeed ordered the September 11th attack on America. He lays out his reasons for it, and he threatens another attack. This tape tends to confirm that bin Laden is alive and well, safely, somewhere. President Bush responded by saying the United States will not be intimidated. Senator Kerry said the country is united in its determination to hunt bin Laden down.
And then again, in September 2007, just days before General David Petraeus was set to deliver his report to Congress on the controversial surge in Iraq, and just days before the 6th anniversary of 9/11, there was Osama bin Laden to remind the public of the ever-present terror threat.
Just days before the 6th anniversary of 9/11, the man responsible for the death and horror that day is coming out of the shadows with a new videotape and more invective aimed at the United States. He lectures Americans on everything from religion to politics to taxes. No overt threats,
but authorities are looking at whether the tape contains any signal to indicate a future attack.
Capitalizing on the conveniently timed video release, President Bush was quick to cite it as evidence that Al Qaeda was connected to the war in Iraq, and that the increasingly unpopular war, now generally understood to have been an illegal invasion waged on false pretenses, was in fact an essential part of the war on terror.
I found it interesting that on the tape, Iraq was mentioned, which is a reminder that Iraq is a part of this war against extremists.
But buried beneath the attention-grabbing headlines and substanceless sound bites with which the media covered this release, troubling questions began to arise about the nature of the video. The aging, weary, gaunt, graying, and partially paralyzed Osama bin Laden of 2001 was gone, replaced by a visibly younger and healthier man, despite having numerous health problems, and despite having presumably spent the better part of a decade on the run as the world's most wanted man. Sporting jet black hair and what many media commentators pointed out looked like a fake beard, the figure on the screen seemed to be moving in an unrealistic way. Bizarrely, the video freezes at the 1 minute and 58-second mark while the audio continues. The image remains frozen for most of the video message, only resuming briefly around the 12-minute mark. What's more, all of the references to current events, those parts referenced in passing on the evening news as proving that Osama is still alive, take place during the times when the video is frozen. In fact, the video proved so unusual that media commentators had to go out of their way to assure their viewers that it was indeed real.
Our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross, joins me again tonight from New York. Brian?
Charlie, U.S. authorities say tonight there is no doubt the tape is authentic. It is bin Laden, black beard and all.
Perhaps the strangest part of the video, however, was the manner in which it was released to the public. The video, it turns out, was not released by Al Qaeda, but by the US government. The month after the video's release, it was reported that the video had originally been intercepted by Site Intelligence Group, described as one of several small commercial intelligence firms that specialize in intercepting Al Qaeda's internet communications, often by clandestine means. According to the Washington Post, site founder Rita Katz told the Post that her company covertly obtained an early copy of a bin Laden video message in early September, then shared the video with senior administration officials on September 7th on the condition that it not be distributed or made public before its official release. Soon afterward, the video was downloaded by dozens of computers registered to government agencies. Within hours, Site's copy of the video was leaked to television news networks and broadcast worldwide. It was not explained how Site had obtained an early copy of an Osama bin Laden video, but it was far from the only time that mysteriously well-connected internet researchers had unexplained exclusive access to Al Qaeda video productions. Researchers and companies who supposedly scooped the intelligence agencies by discovering and publishing Al Qaeda messages, sometimes even ahead of Al Qaeda itself, included SITE, or the Search for International Terrorist Entities, whose promotional materials touted the company's one-of-a-kind access to messages, videos, and advance warnings of suicide bombings from the most hard-to-reach corners of violent online extremist communities, whose clientele included leading media outlets and even government agencies, and whose founder, Rita Katz, was born in Iraq to a wealthy Jewish businessman father who was convicted of spying for Israel in 1969 in a military tribunal and executed in a public hanging, which, we are told, Katz did not think had much bearing on her work, and who, despite not having any intelligence connections herself, found a job allowing her to search for terrorists online shortly after moving to New York in the 1990s. Laura Mansfield, a pseudonymous South Carolina housewife who, despite being a self-described
mom sitting here in her dining room, typing away on my computer,
is fluent in Arabic, likes to monitor jihadi message boards and chat rooms, and who, with no special training or connections to the world of terror or espionage, was consistently able to find and publicize Al Qaeda videos before anyone else, including a 2007 video of Osama bin Laden that, it was quickly discovered, was actually a 5-year-old video that had already been previously released, but reported as new by the credulous mainstream press, and multiple releases featuring Azam the American, aka Adam Perlman, the Jewish Californian whose grandfather was a board member of the Anti-Defamation League and who, we are told, converted to Islam with a single internet post and was quickly recruited by Al Qaeda to serve as translator, video producer, and cultural interpreter for their media committee.
O you who believe, fight the unbelievers who are closest in proximity to you, and let them find harshness in you, and know that Allah is with those who fear Him.
And Intel Center, a company described as a private contractor working for intelligence agencies and headed by Ben Vensky, the former director of intelligence special projects at iDefense, where he worked alongside people like Jim Melnick, a psychological operations specialist who served 16 years in the U.S. Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency, that similarly supplied the U.S. government and media with Al Qaeda videos released by As-Sahab, the terror group's media production arm, and somehow exclusively obtained by this private contractor in Virginia. The public had good reason to question the reality of these suspiciously timed and mysteriously sourced audio and video recordings. In 1999, William Arkin wrote a piece for the Washington Post called "When Seeing and Hearing Isn't Believing," in which he reported on the digital morphing technologies that were then being worked on by research teams at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico and elsewhere. He reported on one demonstration of this technology, a fake recording of General Carl W. Steiner, former Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Special Operations Command, announcing, "Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government." The fake audio was so impressive that General Steiner asked for a copy. Another demonstration involved Colin Powell announcing that he was being well treated by his captors. Digital morphing, voice, video, and photo, has come of age, available for use in psychological operations. PSYOPs, as the military calls it, seeks to exploit human vulnerabilities in enemy governments, militaries, and populations to pursue national and battlefield objectives. Being able to manufacture convincing audio or video, they say, might be the difference in a successful military operation or coup. The technology continued to feature in PSYOPs planning as the War of Terror dragged on. In 2003, the CIA Iraq Operations Group came up with a wacky idea for discrediting Saddam Hussein in the eyes of his people. To create a video purporting to show the Iraqi dictator having sex with a teenage boy. Amazingly, Stein also confirmed that the CIA did make a fake video of Osama bin Laden. The agency actually did make a video purporting to show Osama bin Laden and his cronies sitting around a campfire, swigging bottles of liquor and savoring their conquests with boys, one of the former CIA officers recalled, chuckling at the memory. But as successful as these information operations and Al Qaeda media releases were in keeping the terror threat in the minds of the public, the neocons directing this war of terror were going to need much more than that to meet their objectives. The war on terror, launched in Afghanistan and waged in Iraq, was never meant to end there.
The other strain of radicalism in the Middle East is Shia extremism, supported and embodied by the regime that sits in Tehran. Iran has long been a source of trouble in the region. It is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Iran's actions threaten the security of nations everywhere. That is why the United States is rallying friends and allies around the world to isolate the regime, to impose economic sanctions. We will confront this danger before it is too late.
But getting the public, already weary of the years-long struggle in Afghanistan and increasingly disillusioned with the debacle in Iraq, on board with the invasion of yet another country, was going to be difficult unless another spectacular terror event came along to justify opening up yet another front in the war on terror. And, if the terror boogeyman was not willing to provide such a justification, the neocons were once again ready and willing to create it.
What you're writing there is that Cheney, there was a meeting in the White House where Cheney presided over, looking to cook up the next war. A false war based on false intelligence.
a dozen ideas proffered how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard, build 4 or 5 irate boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives. And it was ejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation.
Seymour Hersh was not the only one warning about the possibility of the Bush White House staging a terror event in the waning days of its administration to trigger a bold new escalation with Iran. Even Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose involvement in Operation Cyclone started the American involvement in Afghanistan that led to the creation of Al Qaeda in the first place, warned the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2007 that a military provocation or terrorist act whose origin would be very difficult to trace could be staged and blamed on Tehran in order to justify U.S. military action on Iran.
A plausible scenario for a military collision with Iran involves Iraqi failure to meet benchmarks, followed by accusations of Iranian responsibility for the failure, then by some provocation in Iraq or a terrorist act in the United States blamed on Iran, culminating in a quote-unquote defensive U.S. military action against Iran that plunges a lonely America into a spreading and deepening quagmire, eventually ranging across Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
But the neocons, suffering from plummeting approval ratings, mounting domestic difficulties, and the ramifications of a global financial crisis, no longer had the political capital to stage terror events and garner public approval for their agenda. By 2008, after 7 long years in the grip of the existential threat that they were told was the basis for a generation-defining civilizational struggle with no end in sight, the American public was getting tired. They didn't want the neocons and their endless war on terror. They were hoping for change. Luckily for them, that's precisely what the 2008 U.S. presidential election seemed to offer.
In the face of war, you believe there can be peace. In the face of despair, you believe there can be hope. We are one nation. We are one people. And our time for change has come.
The public was ready for change. In fact, the idea of a shift from the bellicose, belligerent, aggressive foreign policy of the war on terror rhetoric of the neocons to the promised hope and change of the Obama administration was so enticing that not only did Obama win the 2008 election, he also won over the world at large. So excited were people for the prospect of peace that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee decided to bestow their 2009 prize on Obama before he had taken a single substantive action in office.
God morgen. Good morning. Den norske Nobelkomité har bestemt at Nobels fredspris for 2009 skal tildeles president Barack Obama for hans ekstraordinære innsats for å styrke internasjonalt diplomati og mellomfolkelig samarbeid.
Those not swept up in the hope and change delirium were quick to point out that the committee had made a mistake in handing a peace prize to a president still actively involved in military engagements. What not even his most cynical critics seemed prepared for, however, was the idea that Obama would not only continue the Bush administration's war on terror, but that he would greatly expand it. From the two-front war in Afghanistan and Iraq under Bush, Obama would ultimately lead the war of terror into 7 countries. One of Obama's first moves in office was to oversee a dramatic escalation in Afghanistan, a troop surge that was meant to resolve the security issues in the country, but actually exacerbated them, finally leading to the dramatic downfall of the US-backed regime and the reinstallation of the Taliban in 2021. And as we shall see, despite promising a swift resolution to the war in Iraq, not only was the handover of authority to the Iraqi government delayed as long as legally possible, but the US was ultimately drawn in again as the terror group that they fostered led to a battle against the Islamic State. But the newly revitalized war on terror, now given new cover by a smiling, Peace Prize-winning, softer-spoken commander-in-chief, did not end there. Obama oversaw the expansion of Bush's drone war into Pakistan.
US President Barack Obama, meanwhile, has admitted for the first time that drones are regularly striking Taliban and Al Qaeda targets in Pakistan's tribal areas.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties. For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against Al Qaeda and their affiliates.
He led the kinetic military action in Libya against previous war on terror ally Muammar Gaddafi.
Today,